"I'll stay in the barn," the cowboy promised the widow. Then he became her only hope. The first time Jonah Reed saw the widow's ranch, it looked less like a home and more like a place winter had already decided to bury. Snow moved across the Montana Valley in pale sheets, sliding over the fence rails, gathering in the ruts of the wagon road, and pressing hard against the old barn doors. The sky hung low and gray above the ridgeline. Far off, cattle stood with their backs to the wind. Near the house, a broken pump handle knocked softly against wood, as if the ranch itself was trying to speak and had no strength left. Jonah stopped his horse at the gate and listened. Most men would have noticed the house first, with its smoke leaning thin from the chimney and its porch sagging under old snow. Some would have noticed the widow, Abigail Mercer, standing beside the frozen trough with her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. But Jonah noticed the water. It sat in the trough under a skin of ice, dark around the edges, with a faint reddish stain along the wood. A sorrel mare lowered her head toward it, sniffed once, then turned away with a stiff limp. Jonah's jaw tightened. He had seen water like that before. Abigail looked up when the gate creaked. Her face was tired but not weak. There were women who bent under trouble and women who went still beneath it, like trees holding snow until the branch nearly cracked. Abigail was the second kind. Her brown hair was pinned beneath a plain bonnet. Her dress was faded blue, patched near one sleeve, clean but worn by work no one else had come to help with. A boy of about 11 stood half-hidden near the barn entrance, holding a feed bucket too heavy for him. His eyes stayed fixed on Jonah's hands, the way boys looked at strangers when they had already learned the world could take too much. Jonah dismounted slowly, keeping both hands clear. "Mrs. Mercer?" he asked. "That depends on who's asking." "Jonah Reed." Her eyes narrowed a little. "I don't know that name." "No reason you should." "Then there's no reason for you to be at my gate." Jonah glanced once more at the trough. "Your horses are drinking bad water." The wind dragged a strip of snow between them. Abigail did not answer right away. Her face changed only slightly, but Jonah saw it. A small tightening near the mouth, a breath caught and held, not surprise, fear that someone had finally said aloud what she had been carrying alone. The boy stepped out farther from the barn. "Ma." Abigail lifted one hand, not looking away from Jonah. "Stay back, Samuel." Jonah took one slow step toward the trough. They limp before they quit eating, then they get weak in the shoulders. Some start breathing hard after short work. The boy's mouth fell open. Abigail went very still. "Who told you that?" "Nobody." "Then how do you know?" "I worked a spread near Silver Creek years ago. Old mine cuts up the ridge leaked into their stock line, poisoned the water slow. Took months before folks stopped blaming winter." Her eyes moved toward the high timber north of the ranch, where black pines stood under snow like a wall. Men from town looked at it, 3 of them. They said the well was fine. Maybe they didn't know what they were seeing. Or maybe they did. Jonah looked back at her then. That was when he understood this was not only a sick ranch. There was something heavier here, something with a human hand behind it. The barn door groaned in the wind. Inside, a horse stamped hard. Abigail turned her head at the sound, and for 1 second her brave face broke. It was quick, almost nothing, but Jonah saw a woman counting losses in silence. A husband gone, a ranch failing, a boy growing too fast, horses she loved slowly losing strength while the town watched and waited. He looked down at his boots. "I can trace the line in the morning," he said. "Maybe find where the bad water is entering." "And what would that cost me?" "A cup of coffee, a little feed for my horse, place to sleep out of the weather." Her chin lifted. "In the house?" "No, ma'am." Jonah looked toward the barn. "I'll stay in the barn." Samuel stared at him. Abigail studied his face like she expected a trick to show itself if she looked long enough. Men don't usually ride through a storm asking only for coffee, she said. No, Jonah answered, they don't. Then why are you? He could have told her about the saloon in town, about the two men he had overheard near the back stove, speaking low over whiskey. He could have told her he had heard the Mercer ranch named with a smile that made his skin crawl. He could have told her one man had said, "Let the widow freeze out. By spring she'll sell for pennies." But he did not know Abigail Mercer yet, and a warning given too soon often sounded like a lie. So he said only, because a horse turned away from water and nobody ought to ignore that. For the first time something in Abigail's eyes softened. Not trust, not yet, only a thin crack in the wall she had built around herself. She nodded toward the far stall. You can sleep there. Keep away from the tack room. Keep away from my son. And if I hear one thing I don't like, you'll be back on that road before sunrise. Yes, ma'am. Samuel frowned. You really think you can fix it? Jonah looked at the boy. I think I can find the truth. Fixing comes after. The answer seemed to settle into Samuel more than any promise would have. Jonah led his horse into the barn as dusk folded over the ranch. The air smelled of hay, cold leather, and worry. He unsaddled carefully, rubbed down his gelding first, and checked each hoof before touching his own bedroll. From the corner of his eye, he saw Samuel watching. You always tend your horse first? The boy asked. Jonah kept brushing. A horse carries a man through country that would kill him on foot. Least a man can do is show gratitude. Samuel said nothing, but he stayed a little longer. Later, Abigail brought a bowl of stew to the barn. She did not step fully inside. She placed it on an overturned crate near Jonah's stall, along with a folded gray blanket. Storm gets worse after midnight, she said. I've slept through worse. I didn't ask. Then she turned and walked back toward the house, lantern light trembling around her skirts. Jonah sat on the crate and ate slowly while the wind grew louder. Across the yard, through the falling snow, he could see the warm square of the kitchen window. Abigail moved past it once, then again, a lonely shadow inside a house trying hard to remain a home. Near midnight, the first scream came from the pasture. Not a woman. Not a child. A horse. Jonah was on his feet before the second cry tore through the storm. The barn horses lunged and stamped in their stalls. Outside, snow blew so thick the yard disappeared. He grabbed a lantern and shoved open the barn door just as Abigail burst from the house with Samuel behind her. Scout, the boy shouted, the colt's out. Abigail caught his arm. Samuel, no. But the boy was already pulling against her, wild with fear. Jonah lifted the lantern into the white darkness. Something moved near the north fence. A shape then gone, not the colt, too tall, too quick, a man. His blood went cold. Someone had come to the Mercer ranch in the storm. And whoever it was had not come to help. Jonah moved before Abigail could speak. He thrust the lantern into Samuel's hands and pointed toward the barn door. Stay inside. Samuel's face tightened. Scout's out there. And so is someone else. That stopped the boy cold. Abigail heard it too. Her hand tightened around Samuel's shoulder, pulling him back under the shelter of the barn. The wind screamed through the open doorway, driving snow across the packed dirt floor. Horses jerked and snorted in their stalls, their eyes flashing in the thin light. Jonah stepped into the storm. The cold struck his face like thrown gravel. In 2 breaths, the barn behind him turned into a blurred yellow square. He kept low and moved toward the north fence, one hand raised against the snow, his boots sinking into drifts that had not been there an hour before. Another cry came from the pasture. The colt. Jonah turned toward it and saw a shape near the split-rail fence. Scout was caught close to the far corner, tossing his head, lead rope tangled around a low post. The little horse was not badly trapped yet, but fear could kill a young animal faster than rope if the storm kept rising. Then beyond the fence line, Jonah saw movement again. A dark figure slipped between the pines. Jonah stopped. For a moment he listened past the wind. There it was, the faint crunch of boots retreating through snow, a man moving with purpose, not stumbling, not lost. Whoever had opened that pasture gate knew exactly where the latch was. Jonah looked at the colt, then at the trees. He wanted to follow the man. He went for the horse. Scout reared as Jonah came near, striking at the snow with his front legs. Jonah lowered his voice, soft and steady, the way he had learned long ago from an old horse breaker who said fear listened better than force. "Easy now, easy boy, nobody's taking you tonight." The colt's eyes rolled white. Jonah took one step, then another, waiting between each. Snow filled the brim of his hat and slid down his collar. His fingers were already stiff inside his gloves. When he reached the rope, he caught it low, avoiding the colt's jerking head. "Steady." Scout pulled hard. The rope burned across Jonah's palm, but he held on. He worked the knot loose with his other hand, slow as prayer, until the line fell free from the post. The colt bolted at once. Jonah swung the rope around the nearest rail and let it run through his hands enough to slow him without snapping the animal's neck. Scout fought, then circled, then finally stopped with his sides heaving. By the time Jonah led him back toward the barn, the storm had swallowed every trace of the man in the trees. Abigail stood in the doorway with Samuel held behind her. Her shawl whipped loose around her shoulders, and her eyes went first to the colt, then to Jonah. "Was someone out there?" she asked. Jonah brought Scout inside and shoved the door closed with his shoulder. "Yes." Samuel's face went pale. "Who?" "Couldn't see." Abigail took the rope from Jonah with shaking hands. "The gate was latched." "I know." She looked at him sharply. "How would you know?" "Because I checked it when I came in." The answer settled over them like another layer of cold. For a while nobody spoke. The barn breathed with frightened horses, creaking beams, and the muffled roar of snow hitting wood. Samuel stroked Scout's neck with both hands, whispering to him under his breath. Abigail watched the colt with a mother's fear, but Jonah saw her mind turning somewhere else. A sick water line could be blamed on weather. An opened gate in a storm could not. At last she said, "This ranch has had bad luck for months." Jonah removed his wet gloves. "Bad luck doesn't unlatch gates." Her eyes lifted to his. There was anger in them now, but under it lay something more painful. A woman who had suspected the truth and hated herself for needing a stranger to confirm it. Samuel looked between them. "Ma, who would do that?" "No one," she said too quickly. Jonah did not correct her in front of the boy. But Samuel was old enough to hear the lie. Abigail sent him to the house a few minutes later with strict orders to warm himself by the stove. He argued, then gave up when she used the voice mother saved for moments when fear had turned into command. After he crossed the yard, Abigail remained in the barn with Jonah. Snow slid down from the roof in heavy clumps. The lantern flame bent inside its glass. "You said in town someone might want this place," she said quietly. "I didn't say that." "No, but you thought it." Jonah leaned against the stall rail and looked toward the north wall, where the wind pressed so hard the boards seemed to breathe. "I heard men talking in Red Hollow." Her face hardened. "What men?" "One of them sounded like he had money. The other sounded like he wanted some." "That describes half the town." "They said your ranch would not last the winter." She looked away. "They named it?" she asked. Jonah nodded. Abigail folded her arms tight, not from cold this time. "Mercer land has always drawn hungry eyes. My husband knew it. My father warned me before I married Thomas. Good pasture, good timber, water rights from the ridge. Men smile at you in church and count your fence posts in their heads. Who's been counting loudest? She hesitated. Jonah waited. Finally she said, Silas Pike. The name came out with bitterness held under control. He owns the freight yard, half the livery, and more notes at the bank than folks care to admit. He offered to buy this ranch 2 months after Thomas was buried, told me it was kindness. Jonah's mouth tightened. Was it? No. Did you tell him no? I told him my husband was barely cold in the ground, and he should be ashamed of himself. For the first time that night, Jonah almost smiled. And was he? No. The almost smile faded. Abigail looked toward the house window where Samuel's shadow moved past the curtain. After that, things started going wrong. Fence cut, feed spoiled, a mare found loose near the creek. Men I hired left after one day and would not say why. Then the horses started limping. You report it to Sheriff Bell. She gave a short, empty laugh. He said winter makes widows nervous. Jonah had known towns like Red Hollow. Law could wear a badge and still look away when money entered the room. He reached for his saddlebag and pulled out a small cloth pouch, then walked to the trough inside the barn. Abigail followed him with her eyes. He dipped a tin cup into the water bucket that had been filled from the west well before dusk. Then he opened the pouch and removed a narrow strip of pale cloth. What is that? Something an old mining doctor showed me. He dipped the cloth into the cup and held it near the lantern. Slowly, the pale strip darkened with a greenish stain. Abigail stared at it. Jonah said nothing at first. The stain spread farther. Her voice dropped. That is poison. Metal in the water, more than should be there. She pressed one hand against the stall rail. For a moment, she did not look like a woman angry at the world. She looked like a wife remembering all the times her husband had stood over maps, rubbed his tired eyes, and said something was wrong. Thomas knew, she whispered. Jonah heard the hurt beneath the words. He tried to trace the spring line the summer before he died. Said runoff had changed after a rockslide near the old cuts. Everyone told him he was chasing shadows. She swallowed. Then he took fever that winter. I was left with debts, sick horses, and men telling me to be practical. Practical usually means give up what someone else wants. Her eyes moved back to him. Outside, the storm began to lessen, but the cold deepened. The barn seemed quieter now. The kind of quiet that came when two people stood on the edge of a truth that would cost them something. Abigail straightened. Can you prove where it enters the line? Maybe. How long? If the ground lets me dig a few days. And if it does? Longer. I cannot pay wages for longer. I didn't ask for wages. That makes no sense. Not everything has to. She looked at him for a long moment. Men who say that usually want something they have not named yet. Jonah accepted that without offense. Fair enough. What do you want, Mr. Reed? He looked at the lantern. The flame shook in the draft, bright, small, stubborn. He thought of the saloon, of men laughing over a widow's ruin. He thought of the horse turning away from poisoned water. He thought of Samuel standing with a feed bucket in both hands, already learning to hide fear because his mother needed him strong. I want to know whether this ranch is dying, Jonah said, or being killed. Abigail's face changed at that. The words were rough, but they were honest. And in a place where people had offered her polite lies for months, honesty felt almost dangerous. She pulled her shawl tighter around herself. You can look at the line tomorrow. Jonah nodded. But hear me clearly, she added. This is still my ranch. My son is still my son. And I do not need some drifting cowboy deciding he has become master of either. No, ma'am. I mean it. I heard you. A gust pushed snow against the barn wall. Somewhere in the house, Samuel coughed once near the stove. Abigail turned toward the door, then stopped. She did not look back when she spoke again. I left coffee on the kitchen step. It'll be cold by now. Jonah looked at her. That is not an invitation inside, she said. I know. Then she crossed the yard and disappeared into the house. Jonah stood alone in the barn, listening to the storm fade over the valley. He should have saddled up at first light. That was what he always did when trouble began growing roots around him. Stay too long and folks started expecting things. A man started caring, then leaving hurt worse than staying ever could. But when he looked toward the north ridge, he thought of the dark figure slipping between the pines. By morning he knew two things. The widow's water was poisoned, and someone had come back in the storm to make sure it stayed that way. Morning came without warmth. The storm had passed east before sunrise, leaving the Mercer ranch buried in clean white snow that made every broken thing look innocent. Fence posts wore soft caps. The barn roof shone under pale light. The north pasture stretched quiet beneath a thin crust of ice, as if no man had crossed it in the dark. But Jonah knew better. He was already outside before Abigail stepped onto the porch. He had tied his coat close, wrapped his scarf up to his jaw, and begun tracing the line from the west trough toward the ridge. In one hand he carried a shovel. In the other, a short iron rod he used to test the ground. His horse stood in the barn doorway watching him with patient eyes. Abigail held a cup of coffee in both hands and watched from the porch for a moment before calling, "You always start work before daylight." Jonah did not look up. Ground's harder after sun hits the top and freezes the melt again. That sounds like something you made up to avoid breakfast. This time he did glance back. There was no smile on her face, but something near it touched her eyes, only for a second. Then it disappeared as if she had caught herself doing something unsafe. Samuel came out behind her with his coat buttoned wrong and his hair flattened on one side from sleep. "Can I help?" "No," Abigail said. "Yes," Jonah said at the same time. They both looked at him. Jonah planted the iron rod into the snow. He can carry markers, no digging near the trench, no wandering past the fence, no touching pipe unless I say. Samuel straightened at once. Abigail's mouth tightened. "He has chores." "I can finish them after," Samuel said quickly. "You said that yesterday and left hay scattered across half the stall." "I cleaned it." "You pushed it behind the tack barrel." Samuel looked down. Jonah lowered his eyes to the ground so the boy would not see his face. He knew that kind of guilt, small boy guilt, the kind that came not from laziness, but from wanting to be useful in bigger ways than childhood allowed. Abigail sighed. "An hour, then schoolwork." Samuel nearly smiled. "Yes, ma'am." He hurried inside for gloves, and Abigail stepped down from the porch. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she came closer to Jonah. "You do not need to make him feel grown," she said quietly. "I'm not." "Then what are you doing?" "Letting him be useful." Her eyes moved toward the barn, where Samuel had disappeared. "He already thinks he has to carry too much." Jonah looked at her then. Maybe carrying something small beside someone else is better than carrying fear alone. Abigail had no answer for that. The wind moved over the yard, lifting loose snow in thin silver lines. Somewhere inside the barn, a horse snorted. Abigail turned away first, but not before Jonah saw the thought pass through her face. She was not used to anyone seeing her son clearly. Maybe she was not used to being seen clearly herself. For the next hour, Samuel followed Jonah along the buried water route, placing small strips of red cloth on fence wire wherever Jonah marked a section to inspect. The boy asked questions as fast as breath allowed. "How deep does the pipe run?" deep enough to avoid ordinary frost, not deep enough for a bad winter. What happens if metal gets in the water? Depends on the metal. Some makes animals sick slow, some kills quick. Can people drink it? Jonah paused. Samuel noticed. Have we been drinking it? House line comes from the east pump, doesn't it? Yes. Then likely not. Likely. Jonah pushed the iron rod into the snow again. Likely is honest, certain comes after testing. Samuel went quiet for several steps. Then he asked softer, did bad water kill my pa? Jonah stopped fully this time. The question drifted between them in the cold. Abigail was not close enough to hear, standing near the barn with a grain sack against her hip. Jonah looked at the boy's face and wished some questions came with easier mercy. I don't know, Jonah said. Samuel swallowed. People said fever. People may be right. But maybe not. Maybe not. The boy looked toward the hill behind the house, where a small wooden cross stood under snow near a cottonwood tree. Thomas Mercer's grave. Jonah had noticed it the night before, half buried but tended. No weeds. No sagging board. Someone still brushed snow from it when storms passed. My ma doesn't talk about it, Samuel said. Some pain gets too heavy for words. She cries when she thinks I'm asleep. Jonah looked down at the pipe marker in his hand. Samuel wiped his nose on his sleeve, embarrassed by what he had said. Don't tell her I told you. I won't. And don't act sad around her, she hates that. Jonah gave one slow nod. Most strong folks do. Samuel studied him. Were you strong when your pa died? No. The boy seemed surprised by the quick answer. Jonah bent and scraped snow away from a low patch in the ground. I was angry, that's different. At who? Everybody breathing. Samuel considered that in silence. From the barn, Abigail called his name. The hour was over. Samuel looked disappointed but did not argue. He handed Jonah the remaining cloth markers. I can come back after schoolwork. If your mother allows. Samuel rolled his eyes, then remembered he was near a grown man and tried to hide it. Jonah did not smile until the boy had turned away. By noon the work grew harder. The sun came out weakly, just enough to put a glassy shine over the snow but not enough to soften the ground. Jonah dug at the first marked section near the west pasture gate, each shovel strike ringing against frozen earth. Beneath the top crust, the soil was dark and wet, smelling faintly sharp. Abigail brought him bread wrapped in a cloth and another cup of coffee. You do not stop unless someone tells you, she asked. Stopping makes starting again worse. So does falling over in a trench. He accepted the coffee, mostly because refusing would have turned into argument. She stood beside him while he drank. Her eyes moved along the line of red markers stretching toward the ridge. Thomas used to mark fence repairs with strips of my old dresses, she said suddenly. I would get cross with him for cutting cloth without asking. Jonah waited. He always said a bright color kept a man from forgetting where the trouble started. Her fingers tightened around the cloth in her hands. I found red strips along the north fence the day after he died. He must have put them there before the fever took him. Jonah looked toward the ridge. What happened to them? Wind took some, cattle tore some down, the rest I removed. Why? Her face closed a little. Because I was tired of looking at trouble no one would help me fix. A crow called from a fence post, harsh against the white morning. Jonah set the cup down. Where was he working last? Abigail looked toward the same rise, near the old wash below Pike Ridge. Pike Ridge? That is what folks call it now. Was it called that when your husband was alive? No, her voice turned colder. It was called Mercy Ridge. Silas Pike bought the timber claim beyond it after Thomas passed and started calling it after himself before the ink was dry. Jonah pushed the shovel into the ground and leaned on it. Old mine cuts up there. Silver cuts from before my father's time, shut down after a cave-in. No one goes near them. Someone does. She looked at him. Jonah pointed toward the snow between two pines beyond the fence. Fresh horse track, not ours, not from last night's storm, made this morning after the snowfall settled. Abigail stared at the faint mark. She would have missed it if he had not shown her. A half-moon print pressed near the timber, already softening at the edges. Could be a rider passing through. Could be. You don't believe that? No. Her expression shifted, anger and fear moving under the surface like water beneath ice. Silas Pike owns land beyond that ridge. Yes. And if he knew the runoff crossed my line, then your poisoned well may not be an accident. Abigail turned away sharply. For a moment, Jonah thought she might walk back to the house. Instead, she gripped the fence rail with both hands and stared at the ridge as if she could force the truth out of it by will alone. I hate him, she whispered. The words were quiet, but they carried weight. Then she closed her eyes. I hate that I hate him. Thomas would tell me bitterness is a poor roof, doesn't keep out rain, only blocks the sun. Jonah leaned the shovel against his shoulder. Thomas sounds like a better man than most. He was. Her voice trembled once, then steadied. And I am so tired of people speaking his name like it belongs to the past. This ranch was his dream. Samuel was his joy. I was his wife. Not some leftover woman waiting for a banker to tell her when to quit. Jonah did not speak. Abigail seemed to realize how much she had said. Her cheeks colored in the cold. She stepped back from the fence. I should not have said all that. Why not? Because you are a stranger. Yes. And strangers leave. Jonah looked down at his gloves. The leather was cracked across the knuckles, stained from old work and older roads. Most do, he said. The answer hurt her. He saw it before she turned aside. Not because she knew him, but because every leaving sounded alike to a woman who had already stood beside a grave. By late afternoon, Jonah found the first break. It lay beneath a shallow bend where the ranch line passed near a drainage ditch coming down from the ridge. The pipe had not split from frost. A narrow seam had been forced open, then packed badly with clay and scrap tin, as if someone had wanted bad water to seep in slowly without making the damage easy to notice. Abigail crouched beside the trench, her skirt gathered carefully out of the mud. Samuel stood behind her, pale and silent. Jonah lifted the scrap tin with 2 fingers. There were tool marks along the edge. Fresh enough to show. Abigail stared at it. That was done by hand. Yes. Samuel whispered, someone hurt the horses on purpose. Abigail closed her eyes. Jonah wished the boy had not seen it, but hidden truths had a way of turning children into prisoners. Better a hard truth in daylight than fear growing teeth in the dark. He placed the tin on the snow. This only shows tampering, it does not prove who. But we know, Abigail said. Knowing and proving are different trails. Samuel's face tightened, then we prove it. His mother turned, Samuel. No, his voice cracked, but he did not back down. Pa knew, you knew, Mr. Reed knows. Everybody in town keeps pretending. I'm tired of pretending. The words shook in the cold air. Abigail reached for him, but Samuel stepped back, ashamed of his own tears. He turned and ran toward the barn, boots slipping in the snow. Abigail started after him. Jonah's voice stopped her. Let him have a minute. He is 11. I know. He should not have to feel this. No, but he does. She looked at him with pain sharpened by helplessness. You speak like a man who knows too much about boys hurting. Jonah looked toward the barn door where Samuel had disappeared. For a moment, the past rose before him so clearly he could smell smoke. A burned-out line shack. His mother's hands blackened from trying to save papers that did not matter. His younger brother crying into a saddle blanket. Men in town saying accident because accident was easier than truth. He swallowed it down. "I know enough," he said. The light faded early behind the ridge, turning the snow blue. Abigail carried the marked scrap tin to the house wrapped in cloth like a piece of evidence, or maybe a piece of grief. Jonah stayed outside to cover the open trench before nightfall. When he finally returned to the barn, Samuel was waiting near the stall. The boy's eyes were red, but his jaw was set. "You said fixing comes after finding truth," Samuel said. "That's right. Well, we found some." "Some?" Samuel held out Thomas Mercer's old work gloves. They were too large for him, patched across both palms. "These were my pa's. Ma keeps them in the kitchen drawer. She doesn't know I took them." Jonah looked at the gloves, then at the boy. Samuel lifted his chin. "Use them tomorrow. If somebody's trying to kill our ranch, then Pa ought to help stop them." Jonah stood very still. There are moments when a man knows he is being handed more than leather and thread. Samuel was not offering gloves. He was offering trust, grief, and a place in a fight that had begun before Jonah ever rode through the gate. Slowly, Jonah accepted them. "I'll bring them back clean if I can," he said. Samuel nodded once, then turned toward the house. Jonah remained in the barn aisle long after the boy left. The old gloves rested heavy in his hands. Outside, the north ridge darkened against the evening sky. Then a low sound came from beyond the pasture. Not wind. A wagon. Jonah moved to the barn door and looked out. Far down the snowy road, 2 lanterns were coming toward the Mercer ranch. The wagon lanterns came slowly through the snow, rocking side to side in the deep ruts of the road. Jonah stood inside the barn shadow with Thomas Mercer's old gloves still in his hands. He watched the lights grow larger through the dark. One lantern hung from the front board. The other swung from a hook near the wagon bed, throwing uneven yellow flashes across the falling snow. Abigail stepped out onto the porch before Jonah could cross the yard. She had wrapped her shawl tight, but she had not taken time to button her coat properly. Samuel stood behind her in the doorway, half hidden by lamplight from the house. "Who is it?" she called. The wagon stopped near the gate. A man climbed down with slow care, as if he wanted every movement noticed. Tall, thick through the shoulders, wearing a fine dark coat that had no business on a muddy ranch road. His hat brim was brushed clean of snow. His boots shone even in weak lantern light. "Silas Pike." Jonah knew it before Abigail said the name. "Mrs. Mercer," Pike called, voice smooth as warm butter over a dull knife. "Cold night for visitors, I know." "Then go home." Pike smiled faintly, as if she had made a joke for his pleasure. "I came on business." "No business I want." A second man climbed down from the wagon. Younger, narrow-faced, carrying a leather satchel under his arm. Bank clerk, maybe, or someone paid to look official enough to frighten tired people. Jonah stepped out from the barn then. Pike's eyes shifted to him. The smile stayed, but the warmth left it. "And you must be the hand folks are whispering about." "Just passing through," Jonah said. "Are you?" Pike looked from Jonah to the barn, then to Abigail on the porch. "Seems some men pass slower than others." Abigail came down one step. "Say why you're here." Pike adjusted his gloves. "Gladly. Mr. Crane from the bank has papers requiring your attention." Samuel moved closer behind his mother. The narrow-faced man opened the satchel and withdrew a folded document protected inside oiled cloth. "Mrs. Mercer, Your extension agreement contains conditions regarding property upkeep, stock health, and outstanding feed debt. Mr. Hargrove asked that I deliver notice. Abigail did not reach for it. Mr. Hargrove gave me until Christmas. Yes, ma'am, Crane said, unable to meet her eyes, but new concerns have been raised. Jonah looked at Pike. Pike looked back calmly. What concerns? Abigail asked. Neglected livestock, Crane said. Samuel burst out, that's a lie. Abigail lifted a hand, but the boy was shaking with fury now. Our horses are sick because someone poisoned the water line. Pike's brows rose. Poisoned, that is a dangerous word for a child. He's telling the truth, Abigail said. Pike turned to her slowly. Then I trust you have proof. The yard went quiet except for wind moving loose snow along the fence. Abigail's face tightened. Jonah knew she was thinking of the scrap tin wrapped in cloth on the kitchen table. It proved someone had tampered with the pipe. It did not prove Pike had touched it. Not yet. Pike took one step toward the porch. Mrs. Mercer, I understand grief can make a person see enemies where there are only hard seasons. Jonah's hand closed around the old gloves. Abigail's voice turned low. Do not speak of my grief. I speak only with concern. This ranch has been declining for some time. Your stock is weak. Your fences are poor. Your debt is growing. You have a child to think of. I think of him every breath I take. Then think clearly. Pike's tone softened, which somehow made it worse. Sell before winter finishes what pride has started. Samuel stepped out beside his mother. We're not selling. Pike's eyes slid to the boy. Young man, grown matters are best left to grown people. Jonah moved before he planned to. He crossed the yard with slow steps and stopped between Pike and the porch. Not close enough to threaten, close enough to be understood. Boy lives here, Jonah said. That makes it his matter. Pike studied him. You have a habit of placing yourself where you do not belong, Mr. Reed. Been told that. Drifters often confuse a few nights under a roof with having a stake in the land beneath it. I sleep in the barn. Pike smiled. Yes, Red Hollow has heard. Abigail's cheeks colored, but she did not lower her eyes. Jonah felt a colder anger stir in him. Pike was not only trying to take the ranch, he was trying to shame her in the taking, to make every act of survival look like scandal. Crane cleared his throat and held the document out toward Abigail. This is formal notice of inspection. 3 days from now, the bank will send men to judge whether the property remains secure against the note. The bank sends inspectors through snow, Jonah asked. Crane glanced at Pike, then back down. In certain circumstances. Circumstances named by Mr. Pike. Pike's smile faded. Careful. Jonah held his gaze. I usually am. Abigail came down the remaining porch steps and took the paper from Crane. Her hand did not tremble, but Jonah noticed how hard she had to work for that. Tell Mr. Hargrove his men can inspect anything they like, she said. They will find a working ranch. Pike gave a soft laugh. Will they? Yes. He looked toward the west pasture. Even that water line your boy claims is poisoned. Abigail folded the notice once slowly, especially that. For the first time, Pike's jaw tightened. It was slight, nearly hidden, but Jonah saw it. Pike had not expected her to stand straighter after hearing the threat. He had expected fear, maybe tears, maybe silence. Abigail gave him none. Crane climbed back onto the wagon, eager to leave. Pike remained a moment longer. His eyes moved over the barn, the house, the trough, and finally Jonah. You might want to choose your friends wisely, Mrs. Mercer, he said. Men who appear from nowhere often have nowhere to return when trouble starts. Jonah's chest tightened. Pike could not know his past, but the words found an old bruise anyway. Abigail stepped beside Jonah. A man who comes from nowhere may still be better than one who owns half a town and has no decency left. The silence after that was sharp enough to cut. Pike's smile disappeared entirely. He tipped his hat once, climbed onto the wagon, and snapped the reins. The horses pulled the wagon around slowly. Snow creaked under the wheels as the lanterns turned back toward the road. Only when they had faded into the dark did Samuel speak. "I hate him." Abigail closed her eyes. "Go inside." "But Ma." "Inside, Samuel." The boy looked ready to argue, then saw her face and obeyed. The door closed behind him with a soft wooden click. Abigail stood in the yard holding the notice. Jonah waited. Snow settled on her hair and shoulders. She looked down at the paper and laughed once under her breath, not because anything was funny, because something inside her had been pushed too hard and had nowhere gentle to go. 3 days, she said. We can make the ranch look better by then. It is not about looks. No. They will find raisins, weak horses, old fences, a widow they think can be frightened. Jonah looked toward the ridge. Then we give them fewer reasons. And Pike. We find proof before he finds another way to ruin you. Her eyes lifted to him. You speak like you are staying. He did not answer quickly enough. That seemed to hurt her more than if he had said no. She nodded once as if reminding herself of something, right passing through. Mrs. Mercer. Abigail. The name came out sudden, and both of them felt it. She looked away first. If you are going to stand in my yard while men like Pike talk down to me, you may as well use my given name. Jonah's voice lowered. Abigail. For one brief second, the cold yard felt warmer than it had any right to. Then she folded the notice and held it against her side. We start before dawn. We. It is my ranch. Yes, it is. And I am tired of watching other people decide whether it lives. She walked back to the house, but this time she paused at the door. There is coffee left on the stove. You can come to the kitchen step for it. Still not inside. Her mouth softened barely, still not inside. Then she went in. Jonah stood alone in the snow, looking at the closed door. He should have been thinking about Pike, the inspection, the poisoned line, the fresh tracks near the ridge. Instead, he found himself thinking about the way Abigail had spoken his name as if it belonged somewhere other than the road. The thought unsettled him. He turned back toward the barn. Inside, Samuel was waiting beside the stall, arms crossed. You heard all that? Jonah asked. Most of it. Your mother told you to go inside. I was inside, near the window. Jonah sighed. That is not what she meant. Samuel ignored that. Can we fix enough before 3 days? We can fix what shows. What about what does? Jonah looked at the boy. That is the harder work. Samuel stepped closer. I know where Mr. Pike's riders cut across our north land. Jonah stilled. How? I've seen them, twice. After Pa died, Ma told me not to ride near the ridge, but sometimes I did anyway. You should have told her. She had enough to worry about. There it was again. A boy trying to spare his mother by carrying fear in secret. Jonah crouched so they were eye to eye. Listen to me careful. Hiding danger from someone you love does not protect them. It only leaves them standing blind when trouble comes. Samuel looked down. Jonah's voice gentled. I learned that late. You can learn it now. The boy swallowed. There's an old wash behind the north timber. It runs near the abandoned mine road. I saw wagon tracks there last month, fresh ones. Can you show me tomorrow? Samuel nodded. Only if your mother agrees. His face fell. I mean it, Jonah said. Samuel kicked at a straw clump. She'll say no. Then we make her understand." A sound came from the house before Samuel could answer. Not loud. A crash, then Abigail's sharp cry. Jonah was running before he thought. He crossed the yard with Samuel close behind and reached the porch as Abigail stumbled out the kitchen door, one hand pressed around the other. Blood seeped between her fingers, dark against her skin. A broken jar lay behind her on the kitchen floor, shining in lamplight. "I'm fine," she said at once. But her face had gone pale. Samuel rushed to her side. "Ma." Jonah took her wrist gently. "Let me see." "It is only glass." "Let me see, Abigail." The use of her name stopped her. Slowly she opened her hand. A deep cut ran across her palm. Samuel's eyes filled. "That's bad." "It looks worse than it is," she said, but her voice shook. Jonah wrapped her hand in a clean cloth from the table and pressed firm. "Hold this tight." "I said I'm fine." "You are bleeding on the floor." She looked down as if surprised by it. For the first time since Jonah had arrived, Abigail Mercer looked truly tired. Not angry, not guarded, just a woman who had held up too much for too long and had finally cut herself on one small, ordinary thing. Jonah kept his hand over hers, steadying the cloth. Samuel stood close, frightened and silent. Outside, the wind moved around the house. The broken glass glittered near the stove. The bank notice lay on the kitchen table beside the wrapped scrap of tin, one threat beside another. Then Abigail whispered, so low Jonah almost missed it, "I cannot lose this place." Jonah looked at her pale face, at the boy beside her, at the house Thomas Mercer had left behind, and at the snow still pressing against every window. Something in him shifted. Not loudly. Not like a vow made for show. Just a quiet decision taking root. "You won't," he said. Abigail looked up at him, and Jonah knew he had said more than a hired man should say. Before she could answer, a horse neighed sharply from the barn. Then another. Jonah turned toward the sound. Through the kitchen window, beyond the yard, a small orange glow flickered near the hay shed. "Fire! Fire!" Jonah said. The word left his mouth low, but it struck the kitchen like a gunshot. Samuel turned toward the window and went white. Abigail pulled away from Jonah at once, forgetting the cut in her hand until pain flashed across her face. Outside, the orange glow near the hay shed brightened, licking upward through the falling snow. "No," Abigail breathed. Then she ran. Jonah caught the lantern from the table and followed her into the yard. The cold hit hard, but the heat ahead was already growing. Flames crawled along the side wall of the hay shed, feeding on dry boards under the overhang where snow had not reached. Smoke rolled low across the yard, bitter and thick. The horses inside the barn were panicking. Samuel raced toward the barn doors. "Samuel, wait!" Abigail shouted. But the boy was already pulling at the latch. Jonah grabbed him by the shoulder and swung him back, not rough, but firm enough to stop him. "Listen to me. My horse is in there. And he stays alive if you do what I say." Jonah pointed to the trough. "Buckets, fill them. Bring them halfway, no farther unless I call." Samuel shook with terror, but he obeyed. Abigail had reached the pump beside the kitchen shed, one hand wrapped in cloth, the other working the handle hard. Every stroke made her injured palm darken through the bandage. She did not stop. Jonah ran to the burning wall. The fire had started low, near the back corner where oil rags were kept in a covered box. He had seen enough range fires to know the difference between accident and a flame placed with intention. Wet snow lay thick around the shed. The roof was white. The ground was soaked. Only one spot burned. Someone had chosen it. "Keep the water coming," he shouted. Abigail filled the first bucket and shoved it toward Samuel. The boy dragged it across the snow, water slopping over his boots. Jonah threw it against the base of the fire. Steam burst into his face, hot and sharp. He coughed, wiped his eyes with his sleeve, and reached for the next bucket. The barn horses slammed against stall doors behind him. Their fear rose with the smoke. A mare screamed so loud Abigail flinched. "The barn will catch," she cried. "Not if we cut the hay wall off." "With what?" Jonah did not answer. He ran inside the open side of the shed, where smoke pressed thick under the beams. Bales were stacked near the far wall, dry enough to turn the whole place into a furnace if flame reached them. He grabbed the nearest hay hook and began tearing bales away from the burning boards. Smoke clawed at his throat. Heat bit his face. Sparks dropped near his sleeves. Outside, Abigail kept pumping water with one hand and carrying with the other, her injured palm leaving spots of blood on the bucket handle. "Jonah," she shouted, "get out." He pulled another bale clear and kicked it toward the snow. "Not yet." The fire snapped through a cracked plank above him. Burning wood fell near his boot. He stomped it out, then swung the hay hook hard into the side wall. Once, twice. The weakened board split. Cold air rushed through the gap. He struck again until the burning section loosened from the frame. Samuel appeared too close with another bucket. "Back," Jonah barked. The boy stumbled away just as a piece of flaming board broke loose and fell into the snow. Abigail threw water over it, then grabbed Samuel and pulled him behind her. Jonah tore down the last burning plank. Snow blew through the open side of the shed and helped smother what remained. He took the next bucket and threw it across the smoking beam. The flame shrank, fought, then folded into black steam. For a long minute, nobody moved. Only the horses made sound, restless and frightened in the barn. Smoke drifted between the buildings. The orange glow faded into dull red cracks along wet wood. Jonah bent over with both hands on his knees, coughing hard. Abigail came to him. "Are you burned?" "No." "Look at me." He lifted his face. Soot streaked one cheek. His eyes watered from smoke. A small burn had marked the edge of his sleeve, but his skin looked whole. Samuel stood behind his mother, breathing fast. Was it him? Abigail closed her eyes at the question. Jonah looked toward the dark road beyond the gate. Snow had already begun filling the tracks, but not fast enough. Near the side of the shed, beside the woodpile, a boot print cut deep into the slush. Bigger than Samuel's. Not Abigail's. Not his own. He knew because his soles had a split mark from an old repair, and this print did not. He crouched beside it. Abigail followed his gaze. Someone was here. "Yes." Samuel's voice shook. "Mr. Pike." Jonah stood slowly. "Maybe one of his men." "That is the same thing," the boy said. Abigail reached for him with her bandaged hand, then winced. Jonah noticed at once. Inside now. "I have to check the horses." "I'll check them. It is my barn. And that hand is still bleeding." Her eyes flashed. "Do not order me around on my own land." Jonah stepped closer, lowering his voice so Samuel would not hear the sharpness in it. "Then stop bleeding on your own land long enough to let me wrap it proper." Abigail stared at him. The anger in her face did not vanish, but it changed. Beneath it was fear. Fear for the ranch. Fear for Samuel. Fear that if she stopped moving even 1 minute, all the grief she had outrun would catch her. Samuel looked from one to the other. "Ma, please." That reached her where Jonah's words had not. Her shoulders sank a little. "Fine, but only after I see the horses." Jonah knew better than to argue further. Together they entered the barn. The horses stamped and snorted, eyes wide, coats damp with fear. Jonah moved slowly down the aisle, speaking low, touching each stall door, checking latches, checking feed sacks, checking for sparks that might have carried through cracks. Abigail went to the sorrel mare first. the one that had turned from the trough days before. She rested her good hand against the mare's neck and whispered something too soft to hear. Samuel stood near Scout's stall. The colt pushed his nose into the boy's chest as if seeking comfort. Samuel wrapped both arms around his neck. "He's all right," Samuel said, more to himself than anyone. Jonah finished checking the last stall and returned to the aisle. No sparks inside. Smoke may keep them restless a while. Abigail nodded. Her face looked pale in lantern light. The cloth around her hand had soaked through. This time she did not resist when Jonah led her to the house. The kitchen still held the broken jar on the floor, the bank notice on the table, and the wrapped scrap of pipe tin beside it. The ordinary room now looked like a place where trouble had found too many doors. Samuel fetched clean cloth from the washstand. Jonah poured water into a basin and washed Abigail's cut gently while she sat stiff-backed in a chair. She watched his hands. They were rough, marked by old scars, careful in a way she had not expected. He worked without hurry, picking out a tiny sliver of glass with the tip of a clean sewing needle held over flame. Abigail hissed through her teeth but did not pull back. Samuel stood close, holding the lamp. "You know doctoring?" the boy asked. "A little. From cattle work. Some. And the rest." Jonah wrapped the clean cloth around Abigail's palm. "From being too far from doctors." Abigail looked at him then. "That sounds lonely." The word surprised them both. Jonah tied the bandage firm but not cruel. "Sometimes." Samuel's eyes moved to Jonah's face. "Did you have a family?" The kitchen went still. Abigail turned sharply toward her son. "Samuel." "It is all right," Jonah said. But his voice had changed enough that Abigail heard the door closing behind it. He kept his eyes on the bandage. Had a mother, a brother, lost them both some years back. Samuel's face softened with instant regret. "I'm sorry." Jonah nodded once. "Me too." Abigail studied him. There was more behind those simple words. She could feel it. A whole country of pain he had walked through and chosen not to name. For the first time, she wondered what kind of man slept in barns not because he had no other choice, but because walls with families inside them hurt too much. She looked down at her hand. "Thank you." Jonah released her gently. "Keep it dry tonight." A faint, tired laugh left her. "Everything outside is snow, mud, or smoke." "Then keep it less wet." The corner of Samuel's mouth twitched. Abigail saw it and almost smiled herself. Then a knock came at the front door. All three froze. It was not a friendly knock, not quick like a neighbor in worry, not loud like a man needing help. 3 steady strikes, spaced apart, as if the person outside knew he had every right to be heard. Jonah stood first. Abigail rose after him. "No, I answer my door." He did not argue, but he stayed close enough to see past her shoulder. She opened the door. Sheriff Amos Bell stood on the porch, his mustache frosted white, hat low against the wind. Behind him waited a deputy on horseback, and beyond them, half hidden near the road, Jonah could make out the dark shape of another rider. The sheriff's eyes moved from Abigail's bandaged hand to Jonah's smoke-blackened sleeve, then passed them toward Samuel. "Evening, Mrs. Mercer." "Sheriff." He removed one glove slowly. "We got word there was trouble out here." Abigail's chin lifted. The hay shed was set on fire. "So I heard." "Then you came quickly for once." The deputy shifted uncomfortably behind him. Sheriff Bell's face hardened. "Mind your words, ma'am. A man in my position hears many claims." Jonah stepped forward. "There are fresh prints near the shed." The sheriff looked at him without warmth. "And you are?" "Jonah Reed." "The drifter staying in her barn." Abigail's face went tight. Jonah saw then exactly what this visit was. Not protection, not concern. The sheriff had not come to ask who set the fire. He had come to look at Jonah. Bell stepped inside without invitation, bringing cold air with him. His gaze moved over the broken jar, the blood-marked cloth, the bank notice, and the soot on Jonah's coat. "Strange thing," the sheriff said. "You arrive at this ranch, and suddenly there is talk of poisoned water, prowlers, and now fire." Samuel burst out. "He saved the horses." Bell glanced at him. "That's so." "Yes," Abigail said, "it is." The sheriff rubbed his jaw. "Maybe, or maybe trouble follows certain men." Jonah held still. Abigail turned fully toward Bell. "What are you saying?" "I am saying Red Hollow knows nothing about Mr. Reed." Bell's eyes stayed on Jonah. "And before this widow puts too much trust in a man passing through, she deserves to know there is a wanted notice 2 counties south for a Jonah Reed." The kitchen seemed to drop into silence. Samuel stared at Jonah. Abigail did too. Jonah felt the old past rise like smoke from a grave. Sheriff Bell reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. "Question is," he said, "are you that Jonah Reed?" The paper in Sheriff Bell's hand looked small, but it changed the whole room. Abigail stood with her bandaged hand pressed close to her waist. Samuel had gone still beside the table, his face pale in the lamplight. The wind scraped against the kitchen windows, carrying the smell of smoke from the half-burned hay shed across the yard. Jonah looked at the folded notice. He did not ask what it said. He already knew enough. Sheriff Bell opened it with slow fingers, enjoying the silence. "Says here, a Jonah Reed is wanted for questioning after a fire near Clearwater Crossing. Line shack burned. 2 men dead. 1 witness claimed Reed fled before dawn." Samuel's eyes widened. Abigail did not move, but Jonah saw her shoulder tighten. Bell watched him closely. "That you?" Jonah's mouth felt dry. "I was at Clearwater." "So you admit it?" "I said I was there." The deputy on the porch shifted, one hand near his coat. Jonah noticed. So did Abigail. Sheriff Bell stepped farther into the kitchen. "Then you understand why I might question the timing. You ride onto a widow's ranch, trouble starts, and now her shed burns. Makes a man curious." "The trouble started before I came," Jonah said. "According to you." "According to her sick horses, cut line, and the man who opened her pasture gate during a storm." Bell gave him a thin smile. "You saw this man?" "A shape in the pines." "A shape?" Bell nodded as if that answered everything. "Convenient." Samuel's hands curled into fists. "He saved Scout. He pulled him out of the storm." "Boy," Bell said, "you are old enough to know not every man who helps once is good. And old enough to know not every man with a badge is either." The room froze. Abigail's breath caught. "Samuel." The sheriff's eyes hardened. Jonah stepped slightly in front of the boy without making it too obvious. "He is scared. Let it pass." Bell looked at him. "You giving orders now?" "No, asking." The sheriff folded the notice back along its worn crease. "I could take you in tonight." Abigail spoke then, "For questioning over something 2 counties away." Bell turned toward her. "Mrs. Mercer, you have a wanted man sleeping in your barn." "You said wanted for questioning." "That is often where wanted starts." She held his stare, "and sometimes it is where lies start." The sheriff's face flushed under his weathered skin. "Careful." "No," Abigail said, her voice quiet but firm. "I have been careful for 3 years. Careful with bankers. Careful with men who think kindness means taking what belongs to me. Careful with townsfolk who whisper while my horses suffer. Tonight someone set fire to my hay shed, and you are standing in my kitchen threatening the man who helped put it out." Bell's jaw moved once. For a moment, Jonah saw the room as if from outside himself. The widow standing in lamplight with one hand freshly bandaged. The boy at the table, frightened but furious. The sheriff holding old paper like it mattered more than fresh smoke. And himself, a man who had spent years leaving before anyone asked the right questions. Abigail turned slightly toward him, but kept her eyes on Belle. Jonah Reed does not leave this ranch tonight. The words struck Jonah harder than he expected. Belle gave a cold laugh. You defending him without even hearing his story. I am saying you will not drag a man from my property on gossip while my shed is still smoking. Gossip, Belle lifted the notice. This is official. Then bring a warrant, bring facts, bring something besides Silas Pike's convenience. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. There it was. The name had landed. Belle folded the paper and tucked it back into his coat. You are making dangerous accusations. So are you. The deputy took one step closer to the door. Belle glanced back at him, then seemed to decide the night was not worth forcing. Not yet. He fixed Jonah with a hard look. Do not leave town. Jonah almost smiled without humor, was not planning on it. Belle stepped onto the porch, then paused. Mrs. Mercer, grief makes lonely people foolish. Remember that before you mistake danger for help. Abigail's face did not change. Good night, Sheriff. She closed the door before he could answer. For a while, nobody spoke. Outside, hooves moved through snow as the sheriff and his deputy rode away. The sound faded slowly, leaving the house quiet except for the stove crackling and the wind humming under the eaves. Samuel looked at Jonah first. Did you kill those men? Abigail inhaled sharply, but Jonah lifted one hand. The boy deserved an answer plain enough to stand on. No. Samuel's eyes searched his face. Were you there when they died? Yes. That answer hurt more. Abigail moved to the table and lowered herself into a chair. Her face had gone still again, but this stillness was different. Not strength now, guarded fear. Jonah looked at the door. I should go to the barn. No, Samuel said quickly. Abigail did not echo him. That told Jonah enough. He picked up his hat from the chair where he had set it while wrapping her hand. You have a right to know, both of you. The boy sat down slowly. Abigail looked at the table, not at Jonah, then speak. Jonah remained standing. It was easier that way. A man could keep shame from taking root if he did not sit beside it. Clearwater Crossing was 5 years ago. My younger brother, Eli, worked a small line shack for the Kerrigan outfit. I had been riding separate range. Came back one evening and found men arguing with him. What men? Abigail asked. Kerrigan's foreman and 2 hired riders. They wanted Eli to sign a statement saying he had lost cattle to wolves. Samuel frowned. Had he? No, cattle were being moved south and sold under another brand. Eli found the tracks and wrote it down. Abigail's eyes lifted now. Jonah swallowed. He was younger than me, but better in most ways. Believed truth could protect a man if he held it high enough. The stove popped sharply. It did not. His voice roughened, and he hated that it did. I came back late, saw fire before I reached the shack. By the time I got there, the whole place was burning. Eli was inside. Samuel looked down. Abigail's face softened despite herself. I pulled him out, Jonah said. Too late. 2 of Kerrigan's men were dead near the corral, shot. I never fired that night, but I had my brother's blood on me and their horses were gone. The foreman lived long enough to tell folks I had done it and run mad. Why would he say that? Samuel whispered. Because a dead thief needs a living villain. Abigail's eyes filled with something quiet and painful. And you ran. Jonah nodded. Why? Because the sheriff there worked for Carrigan in every way but name. Because my mother was already dead. Because Eli was gone. Because I was angry enough that if I stayed, I might have become what they said I was. The truth settled heavily. Samuel asked, "Did they ever find the real killer?" "No." "Did you try?" For a while, Jonah looked toward the kitchen window, seeing years beyond the glass. Then trying turned into drifting. Drifting turned into habit. Abigail looked at his hands. "That is why Belle's paper still follows you." "Yes." "Why did you not tell me?" He met her eyes. "Would you have let me stay?" She did not answer. That answer was honest too. Jonah picked up his hat. "I will sleep in the barn. At first light I can ride on. You have enough trouble without mine." Samuel stood so fast his chair scraped. "No." "Samuel," Abigail said. "No, Ma, he found the pipe. He saved Scout. He put out the fire. Sheriff Bell only came because Mr. Pike wants him gone." Jonah looked at Abigail, not the boy. "Pike may use my name against you." "He already uses anything he can," Samuel said. Abigail closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she looked tired enough to break and strong enough not to. "I do not know what to think," she said. The words were soft, but they landed honestly. Jonah respected them more than quick trust. "I know," he replied. "That story could be true." "It is. But I have heard men lie with tears in their eyes." "I know that too." Her bandaged hand rested on the table near the bank notice. "I cannot place my son's safety on a feeling." "No. And I cannot ignore what you have done for us." He said nothing. The space between them hurt. It was not anger, not exactly. It was the painful place where trust wanted to grow but fear kept stepping on it. Finally Abigail rose. "You may stay until the inspection." Samuel let out a breath. Jonah did not. Abigail continued, "After that we decide what is best." "We." The word caught him, though he tried not to show it. He nodded once, "Fair." She looked toward the sink, where the broken glass still lay scattered. Samuel fetched the broom. The boy hesitated, wanting more to be said, but Abigail's face told him the conversation was over for now. He obeyed. Jonah turned toward the door. "Mr. Reed," Abigail said. The formality returned like a wall, rebuilt in one breath. He looked back. "If there is anything else from your past that can walk onto my porch holding paper, tell me before it arrives." Shame moved through him, quiet and deserved. "There is nothing else like that." She studied him, "Like that?" "Nothing that threatens you." Abigail nodded once, though she did not look comforted. Jonah stepped out into the night. The cold felt cleaner than the kitchen air, but lonelier too. Smoke still curled from the ruined side of the hay shed. He crossed the yard slowly, feeling the weight of the house behind him. For the first time in years, leaving did not feel like freedom. It felt like punishment waiting its turn. Inside the barn, the horses had settled some. Scout lifted his head as Jonah entered, then lowered it again. Jonah moved down the aisle, checking each stall more from habit than need. At the last stall, he stopped. Something had been tucked beneath his saddle blanket. A folded scrap of paper. Jonah picked it up and opened it near the lantern. The writing was rough, pressed hard into the page. "Leave the widow before she buries another man." Jonah read it twice. Then he folded the note and slipped it into his coat. From the loft above came a small sound. He lifted the lantern. Samuel stood at the top of the ladder, pale-faced, staring down at him. "I saw who left it," the boy whispered. Jonah's heart tightened. Before he could answer, a floorboard creaked outside the barn wall. Jonah closed his fingers around the note and blew the lantern lower. The barn fell into a dim amber hush. Above him, Samuel stood frozen at the loft edge, one hand gripping the ladder rail. Outside the wall, another floorboard creaked. Not loud, not careless. A slow weight shifting where no one had any reason to stand. Jonah lifted one finger to his lips. Samuel nodded, though fear had made his face stiff. The horses sensed it first. Scout raised his head. The sorrel mare stamped once, then stood rigid, ears pointed toward the back wall. Jonah moved without sound, setting the lantern behind a barrel so its light would not show clearly through the cracks. Then he reached for the nearest thing at hand, a long wooden rake handle leaning beside the feed bins. He did not want trouble, but trouble had already learned the way to this barn. The back latch lifted, only a finger's width. A strip of cold night slid through the gap. Jonah stepped behind the door just as it opened another inch. A man's boot crossed the threshold, then a shoulder, then the shadow of a hat brim. Jonah swung the rake handle low, not at the man's head, but hard across his wrist. The intruder cursed and dropped something metal into the straw. Samuel gasped from above. The man jerked backward, slamming into the door frame. Jonah grabbed his coat and pulled him fully inside before he could run. They hit the barn wall together. A horse reared against its stall door. The man fought wild, driving an elbow into Jonah's ribs. Jonah lost breath but held on, twisting the man's arm behind him. "Easy," Jonah growled. "You want to wake the whole ranch." The man spat near his boot. "Let go." Jonah shoved him under the lantern light. He was young, maybe 25, with a narrow face, a split lip, and wet snow melting off his coat. Jonah recognized him from town. He had been one of the men outside the freight office that morning, pretending not to watch Abigail pass. "What's your name?" Jonah asked. The man said nothing. Samuel climbed down 2 steps. "That's Miles Dre. He works for Pike." Miles looked up sharply. "Shut your mouth, boy." Jonah tightened his grip. "Speak to him like that again and you'll answer from the floor." The metal object lay in the straw near the door. Jonah pulled Miles forward, keeping hold of his arm, and nudged it into the light with his boot. A small oil flask. The same kind used for lanterns. Samuel stared at it, horror and anger rising together. He came to burn the barn. "No," Miles snapped. "I came to scare him off." "With oil?" Jonah asked. Miles swallowed. "Wasn't going to light it." "Then why bring it?" The man's silence answered better than words. From the house came the sound of a door opening. Abigail's voice cut across the yard. "Samuel." The boy looked toward Jonah in panic. Jonah dragged Miles to the center aisle. "Call her." Samuel ran to the barn door. "Ma, come quick." Within moments Abigail appeared with a lantern in her good hand and her coat thrown over her nightdress. Her bandaged palm was held close against her chest. When she saw Miles, her face changed from fear to something cold and steady. "What is he doing here?" "Leaving a message," Jonah said. He handed her the folded note. Abigail opened it beneath the lantern glow. Her eyes moved across the words, "Leave the widow before she buries another man." For one painful second, the only sound in the barn was a horse breathing hard. Then she looked at Miles. "Who told you to write this?" Miles shifted. "Nobody." "Who told you to come here?" "No one." Jonah bent and picked up the oil flask. "This yours too?" Miles looked away. Abigail stepped closer. There was no shouting in her now. That made her more powerful, not less. "You tell Silas Pike that if he wants my ranch, he can stand at my gate in daylight like a man and say it with his own mouth." Miles laughed weakly. "You think Pike cares what you say?" Jonah felt the young man's arm tense and tightened his hold. Miles looked at Abigail with the cruel confidence of someone repeating another man's words. "You're done, Mrs. Mercer. Bank's coming. Sheriff already knows your hired drifter is wanted. Town knows he's sleeping here. You think decent folks will buy horses from a widow mixed up with a fugitive?" Samuel moved as if to rush him, but Abigail caught the boy with one look. Miles kept talking, because fear often made foolish men louder. "Pike said by Christmas you'll be begging for his offer." Abigail's eyes sharpened. Jonah heard it too. "Pike said." Miles seemed to realize too late what had slipped out. His mouth closed. Jonah leaned closer. "That is the first honest thing you've said." Abigail turned toward Samuel. "Go wake Mr. Shaw." Samuel blinked. "Ezekiel. He lives closest. Tell him to bring his wagon and come now. Tell him we caught one of Pike's men inside our barn with oil." "I can go," Jonah said. "No," Abigail's gaze stayed on Miles. "You keep him here." Samuel grabbed his coat and ran before anyone could argue. The barn door opened and shut, and his small footsteps hurried across the snowy yard. Miles began to struggle again. "You can't hold me." Abigail lifted the oil flask. "You stepped into my barn after dark carrying this. I can hold you until the whole town sees it." "The sheriff won't care." "Maybe not," she glanced at Jonah, "but other people might." The words settled between them. For months Abigail had fought alone, and alone her truth had sounded like grief, fear, and widow's pride. But a witness changed the shape of a lie. So did evidence. So did a frightened hired man who had already spoken Pike's name. Jonah tied Miles to the center post with a length of soft rope, enough to hold him without cruelty. Miles cursed under his breath. Abigail ignored him. She walked to each stall and soothed the horses, her bandaged hand tucked carefully away. When she reached Scout, she rested her forehead against the colt's neck. Samuel returned nearly half an hour later with Ezekiel Shaw riding beside him in an old wagon, his coat buttoned wrong and his gray beard full of snow. The feed store owner climbed down slowly, eyes taking in Miles, the oil flask, and Abigail's pale face. "What happened?" he asked. Abigail held out the note first, then the flask. "Pike's man came to frighten Jonah away, maybe burn my barn." Ezekiel read the note twice. Shame pulled at his mouth. Miles snapped, "You didn't see nothing, old man." Ezekiel looked at him with tired disgust. "I see enough." Abigail's voice softened, but only slightly. "Will you say that tomorrow?" The question cut deeper than any accusation. Ezekiel removed his hat. "I should have said plenty before now." No one answered. He looked at Jonah. "Pike's been leaning on folks, feed debts, freight rates, bank notes. Men talk when they think everybody's afraid enough to keep quiet." "Are they?" Jonah asked. Ezekiel glanced at Abigail, then at Samuel standing beside Scout's stall, small and brave and exhausted. "Maybe some of us are done being afraid." That was when Miles lowered his head and Jonah saw the truth begin to turn. Not fully, not safely, but enough for the night to feel different. Before dawn, Ezekiel took Miles into town tied in the back of his wagon, not to hand him quietly to Sheriff Bell, but to bring him straight to the church steps where morning traffic would see. After the wagon left, Abigail stood in the barn doorway beside Jonah, watching the tracks fade into the gray snow. Samuel had fallen asleep on a hay bale, wrapped in an old horse blanket. For a long while Abigail said nothing. Then she whispered, "If this part touched your heart, stay with us a little longer, because sometimes the truth only begins to breathe when one frightened person finally speaks." Jonah looked at her, surprised by the softness in her voice. She did not look back. Her eyes stayed on the road. "Tomorrow," she said, "Red Hollow will have to choose what kind of town it wants to be." Red Hollow did not wake gently. By sunrise, the whole town knew Ezekiel Shaw had driven through the main street with Miles' dray tied in the back of his wagon, an oil flask beside him, and a warning note folded in the feed store owner's coat pocket. People came out of doorways before the church bell rang. Curtains moved. Men stepped from the livery. Women paused outside the bakery with flour still dusting their sleeves. Nobody spoke loudly at first. That was how shame entered a town. Quietly, Ezekiel stopped the wagon in front of the church steps, where everyone had to see what fear had dragged into daylight. Miles sat stiff-backed in the wagon bed, his face gray from cold and humiliation. He would not lift his eyes. Sheriff Bell arrived 10 minutes later with his coat half-buttoned, and anger already in his stride. "What is this?" he demanded. Ezekiel climbed down slowly. "Evidence. Evidence belongs in my office." "Then maybe your office should have cared when Mrs. Mercer's horses started dying." A few people shifted uneasily. The sheriff's jaw hardened. "Careful, Shaw. I have been careful too long." That sentence moved through the crowd like a match catching dry grass. Jonah stood near the far end of the street beside Abigail and Samuel. He had ridden in with them at first light, though every part of him disliked walking into a town that already had his name in its mouth. His hat was low. His coat still smelled faintly of smoke. Thomas Mercer's old gloves were tucked in his belt. Abigail stood straight despite the bandage around her palm. The cold had reddened her cheeks, but her eyes were steady. Samuel stayed close at her side, not hiding, not speaking, watching the town the way a boy watched grown people when he had finally understood they were not always brave. Sheriff Bell saw Jonah and pointed one gloved hand. "You." Jonah did not move. Bell crossed the street. "I told you not to leave town." "I'm in town." A few men near the livery lowered their heads to hide small smiles. Bell noticed and did not like it. "This is not your business." Jonah looked toward Abigail. "It became my business when Pike's man stepped into that barn with oil." Miles shouted from the wagon bed, "I didn't light nothing." "No," Abigail said, stepping forward. "You were stopped before you could." Sheriff Bell turned on her. "Mrs. Mercer, I will take statements properly, not let this become some street play." "Properly?" Her voice was not loud, but people heard it. "Is that what you call ignoring cut fences, poisoned water, opened gates, and a fire set beside my hay shed?" Bell's face darkened. "You never proved poison." Jonah pulled a wrapped piece of tin from his coat and held it out. Tampered pipe from her west line. Clay packed by hand, tool marks on the edge, metal stain inside the water trench. Bell barely glanced at it. "You a lawman now?" "No." "Then keep your mouth shut." Samuel stepped forward. "He knows more than you." Abigail caught his sleeve, but the words had already landed. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman whispered, "That boy ought not have to say it." Sheriff Bell turned toward the voice. No one admitted speaking. Then the door of the freight office opened. Silas Pike stepped out wearing a charcoal coat, polished boots, and the calm expression of a man who had practiced being innocent in front of mirrors. He looked first at the crowd, then at Miles in the wagon, then at Abigail. For just a second his eyes sharpened with anger. Then it vanished beneath a smile. "Well," Pike said, "this is an unfortunate sight." Ezekiel faced him from beside the wagon. "Your man was caught in Mrs. Mercer's barn last night." "My man?" Pike raised his brows. "Miles has taken day work for many people." Miles looked up quickly, panic flashing across his face. Pike continued smoothly. "If he trespassed, he should answer for it. But I will not have my name dragged through town because a troubled widow has decided every hardship must have a villain." Abigail's face went pale, but she did not bend. Jonah felt Samuel tense beside her. Pike turned his gaze to the boy. "And I do hope the child is not being encouraged to repeat wild claims." That was when Jonah stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. "Say what you want to men, Pike. Leave the boy out of it." Pike smiled at him. There he is, the barn hero. Jonah said nothing. I hear you have a history with fire, Mr. Reed. The crowd shifted again. Abigail turned slightly toward Jonah, not with doubt this time, but with warning. She knew Pike was trying to draw blood in public. Pike's voice grew softer. Strange how flames appear around you. Clearwater Crossing, Mercer Hay Shed. A man could see a pattern. Jonah held his gaze, but inside the old grief pulled hard. Before he could speak, Abigail did. The pattern I see is men with power blaming men with none. The crowd fell quiet. Pike looked at her. You defend him quickly. I defend truth. You barely know him. I know what he has done since he came to my ranch. And what has he done, Mrs. Mercer? Pike asked, letting the question hang with ugly meaning. Abigail's cheeks colored, but her voice stayed clear. He looked at sick horses when the rest of you looked at my debts. He saved my colt from a storm after someone opened the gate. He put out the fire your worker brought oil to start. He treated my hand when I was bleeding. That is what he has done. The town heard every word. Pike's smile thinned. Miles began shaking his head in the wagon bed. I didn't bring oil for Pike. Ezekiel turned. Then why did you say Pike told you she would be begging by Christmas? Miles shut his mouth. Sheriff Bell climbed onto the wagon step and grabbed Miles by the coat. You say another word without me asking, and you'll regret it. That was a mistake. Everyone saw it. The sheriff was not calming a prisoner. He was silencing him. A murmur moved through the street. Clara Boone, the seamstress, stepped out from the bakery porch. Let him speak. Bell turned. This is law business. No, Clara said, voice trembling but clear. It is town business now. Another man near the blacksmith shop called. Let the boy tell it. Miles looked from Bell to Pike, then to the crowd. Fear fought with anger in his face. Men like Miles were brave only in shadows. Daylight made them smaller. Pike spoke sharply. Miles, you should wait for counsel. Miles laughed once, bitter and broken. Counsel, you already cut me loose. Pike's eyes hardened. Miles looked at Sheriff Bell. You said scare Reed off. That's all. Leave the note, splash oil near the shed so he'd think twice. I wasn't supposed to get caught. The crowd erupted in whispers. Bell shouted quiet. But it was too late. Abigail stared at the sheriff. You. Bell's face changed. Not guilt exactly. Calculation. He looked at Pike as if waiting for rescue. Pike gave him none. Samuel whispered, Ma. Abigail put one arm around him, but her eyes stayed on Bell. You helped them. Bell pointed at Miles. That man is lying to save himself. Miles leaned forward, suddenly desperate. You met me behind the jail. Said Pike wanted Reed gone before the inspection. Said if the drifter left, the widow would fold. Pike's voice cut through the street. Enough. But enough had come too late. Ezekiel Shaw lifted the folded note. Who wrote this? Miles looked down. Who? Ezekiel pressed. Miles swallowed. I did. At whose order? Miles did not answer. Jonah watched his hands. They trembled from cold, fear, and the knowledge that all his loyalty had bought him nothing. At whose order? Abigail asked. Miles lifted his eyes, not to Pike but to Sheriff Bell. Bell gave the words, he whispered. Pike paid for them. The town went silent in a way Jonah had never heard before. It was not peace. It was 100 people realizing that what they had allowed in small pieces had become one large cruelty. Pike looked at the crowd. You believe a frightened hired hand. Clara Boone stepped closer. I believe Mrs. Mercer's horses were dying while you offered to buy her land. The blacksmith wiped his hands on his apron. I believe Pike raised freight charges on anyone who brought feed north to her ranch. A farmer near the livery added, I believe Belle laughed when Thomas Mercer said something was wrong with the Ridge runoff. At Thomas's name, Abigail closed her eyes. Samuel looked up at her. Pa told them. The farmer's face fell. He did, son. Abigail pressed her lips together, pain passing through her like a cold wind. Thomas had not been chasing shadows. He had tried to warn them. They had let him stand alone, too. Pike saw the crowd turning and changed his voice. Fine speeches do not pay bank notes, he said. Inspection still happens. Debt still stands. Sick horses still lower value. Feelings will not save Mercer land. Jonah looked at Abigail then. She was shaking now, not from weakness, but from the strain of standing in a town that had finally admitted what it knew only after damage had been done. He wanted to speak for her. More than that, he wanted to take the burden from her shoulders. But it was her land. Her grief. Her moment. Abigail stepped into the street. My ranch is not dead, she said. The water line will be fixed. The horses will recover. The bank can inspect every post, every stall, every inch of pasture. But from this day on, Red Hollow will know this. If I lose Mercer Ranch, it will not be because I was too weak to keep it. It will be because men worked together to steal what a widow and her son were left to protect. No one answered. They did not need to. The words had done what truth sometimes did when spoken in the right place. They made silence feel like confession. Sheriff Bell climbed down from the wagon. This gathering is over. No, Ezekiel said. Bell turned toward him. Ezekiel stood straighter. I am taking Miles to the county marshal in Deer Creek, not your office. Bell stepped toward him. You will do no such thing. The blacksmith moved first, stepping beside Ezekiel, then two ranchers, then Clara Boone, then another man from the livery. Nobody threatened. Nobody shouted. They only stood. Bell stopped. Pike looked around and saw, perhaps for the first time in years, a town that had remembered it was made of more than his money. Jonah leaned close to Abigail. We should go. She looked at him, surprised. Why? Because Pike will still try to win through the bank, and we have 2 days. She nodded, wiping one tear quickly before Samuel could see. But he saw anyway and reached for her hand. They rode back to the ranch under a sky slowly clearing to pale blue. Behind them, Red Hollow remained restless, full of voices that had been silent too long. On the wagon seat, Samuel sat between Abigail and Jonah. For once, he did not ask questions. He only held his mother's good hand and stared at the road ahead. Near the ranch gate, Abigail stopped the wagon. Thomas Mercer's grave stood on the hill beyond the house, its wooden cross bright against the snow. Abigail looked at it for a long time. Then she whispered, They heard you today, Thomas. Jonah looked away, giving her the privacy of that grief. But Samuel leaned against her shoulder. When they reached the barn, the work began without a word. There was no time for rest, no time to talk over what had happened in town. Jonah repaired the trench. Abigail checked feed and led the weakest horses into warmer stalls. Samuel carried tools, water, and fence markers until his arms shook. By evening, the west line ran clearer than before, but not clear enough. Jonah knelt beside the trough, testing the water again with the pale cloth strip. A faint green stain still spread across it. Abigail saw. Her face fell. It is still coming through, she said. Jonah looked toward the ridge, where the old mine road disappeared into black timber. Then the break we found was only part of it. Samuel's voice was small. Where is the rest? Jonah stood slowly. The answer waited above them in the darkening trees. At the source, he said, near the old mine cuts. Abigail looked toward the ridge, then back at him. Thomas went there before he died. Yes. And if Pike knows there is proof up there. Jonah's eyes hardened. He will try to move it before we find it. A crow lifted from the fence and flew toward the pines, black against the winter sky. That night, long after Samuel had gone to bed, Abigail opened the kitchen drawer and took out an old folded map. Thomas's map. Across the top ridge, written in her husband's hand, were 4 words she had never understood until now. Follow the bitter water. Abigail spread Thomas Mercer's map across the kitchen table with both hands, careful not to press too hard with the bandaged one. The paper had yellowed at the folds. Its edges were soft from years inside a drawer, but Thomas's writing still held clear in dark pencil. Lines ran across the north pasture, over the creek bend, past Mercy Ridge, and toward the abandoned silver cuts that had sat quiet above the valley since before Samuel was born. Jonah stood beside the table, hat in his hands. Samuel had been sent upstairs, but both of them knew he was awake. The floorboards above made small, careful sounds every few minutes, followed by silence. A boy trying not to be heard could be louder than a horse in a quiet barn. Abigail touched the words at the top of the ridge. Follow the bitter water. Her voice came out thin. He wrote that 3 weeks before the fever took him. Jonah leaned closer. Did he bring anything back from the ridge? A broken lantern, torn coat sleeve, mud on his boots that smelled sharp like old pennies. She closed her eyes a moment. I asked what happened. He said a timber beam gave way near one of the cuts, told me not to worry. But he was worried. He did not sleep that night. Abigail opened her eyes again, shining with old memory. I woke near dawn and found him at this very table, drawing this map with a candle burned nearly to the dish. When he saw me, he folded it fast. Jonah studied the markings. There was a small X near an old drainage channel west of the mine road. Another mark near the upper spring. Not random. Thomas had been tracing the path of the water before it reached the Mercer line. He found something, Jonah said. Abigail nodded slowly, and I was too buried in grief afterward to understand it. That is not your fault. Her eyes rose to him. People say that when fault no longer matters. It still matters if you are putting it on the wrong shoulders. She looked away first. Wind moved against the kitchen windows. Outside, the ranch lay quiet beneath moonlit snow, but neither of them trusted quiet anymore. Pike had lost ground in town, but desperate men did not become harmless. They only became less careful. Jonah tapped the map near the marked drainage. We need to ride before sunrise. No. He looked at her. Abigail folded her arms. If there is proof on my land, I go. It may not be safe. I did not ask if it was safe. Samuel needs you here. Samuel needs this ranch saved. Jonah's jaw tightened. If Pike has men watching the ridge, they will not step aside because you own the place. Her face hardened, and they will not confess because you ride up alone. The argument sat between them, sharp and familiar, though they had not known each other long enough to deserve familiar arguments. Jonah lowered his voice. Abigail. She seemed to feel her name before she answered. I have buried one man who thought he had to protect me by keeping danger quiet, she said. Do not stand in my kitchen and ask me to thank another for doing the same. That ended it. Jonah looked down at the map. All right, he said. We leave before dawn. Samuel stays with Ezekiel. He will hate that. He can hate it alive. A small sound came from the stairs. Abigail turned. Samuel Mercer, come down if you are going to listen. For a moment nothing moved. Then Samuel appeared halfway down the stairs, wrapped in a blanket, his hair standing wild on one side. I wasn't listening, he said. Jonah looked at him. Samuel sighed. I was listening some. Abigail held out her good hand, and the boy came the rest of the way down. He stood beside her, looking at the map. "You're going to the ridge," he said. "Yes," Abigail answered. "I should go." "No, but I know the old wash." Jonah crouched slightly so his eyes met the boy's. "You know the ranch. That means you know why somebody has to stay and watch it." Samuel's mouth tightened. That is what grown men say when they want boys out of the way. "Sometimes, not this time," Jonah pointed toward the map. "If your mother and I do not return by noon, you take Thomas's map to Ezekiel Shaw, not Sheriff Bell, not the bank. Ezekiel, you understand." The boy went still. Abigail looked at Jonah sharply, but he kept his eyes on Samuel. "Why wouldn't you return?" Samuel asked. "Storm, bad trail, broken bridge, anything." "You mean Pike?" Jonah did not lie. "Maybe." Samuel's eyes filled, but he blinked hard. "I can ride with you." Abigail knelt in front of him, gathering the blanket tighter around his shoulders. "You are the bravest part of this house," she said softly. "That is why I need you to do the hardest thing and stay." His face twisted. "I hate staying." "I know. What if you don't come back?" Her hand trembled on his cheek. "Then you keep breathing. You hear me? You keep breathing and you take the map to Ezekiel and you remember your father was right." Samuel threw his arms around her neck. Jonah looked away, giving them what privacy the small kitchen allowed. He stared instead at the window, where his reflection looked like a stranger beside a family he had no right to want. Before dawn, the ranch moved in whispers. Abigail packed Thomas's map inside her coat. Jonah saddled 2 horses, choosing the surest-footed mounts. Samuel stood by the gate with his jaw set and his fists buried in his pockets. Ezekiel had arrived before first light, carrying a rifle he kept unloaded but visible, mostly for comfort and town gossip. "I'll keep the boy and the place watched," Ezekiel said. Samuel scowled. "I don't need keeping." Ezekiel nodded solemnly. "Good, then you can help keep me." That softened the boy by half an inch. Abigail kissed Samuel's forehead. He endured it badly, then grabbed her sleeve. "Come back before noon." "I will try." "Promise." Her eyes flicked to Jonah. He saw the pain in them. Promises had become dangerous things in this house. So Jonah answered instead, "I promise I will do everything I can to bring her back." Samuel looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. They rode north as the first pale light touched the ridge. The trail narrowed past the upper pasture, where snow lay deeper between the pines. Abigail rode well, better than Jonah expected, keeping her horse steady over ice-slick ground. The world grew quieter the higher they climbed. Red Hollow disappeared behind them. The ranch became a small dark shape below. Above, the old mine road twisted into timber. Halfway up, Jonah saw the first sign. Fresh wagon tracks. He raised a hand. Abigail stopped beside him, breath smoking in the cold. "Pike." Someone came through before dawn. The tracks cut toward the old wash marked on Thomas's map. They followed slowly. Soon the trees opened into a narrow hollow where rusted rail spikes and broken beams jutted from the snow. The abandoned silver cut yawned in the hillside, black and half-collapsed. Water trickled from somewhere inside, staining the rocks orange and green as it ran into a shallow channel leading down toward Mercer land. Abigail dismounted, her face pale. "This is it," she whispered. Near the mouth of the cut lay a rotted wooden sluice board, recently moved. Behind it, wedged beneath stones, Jonah found a length of pipe and an old iron diverter, hidden from the main trail. Not natural runoff. Someone had guided the poisoned water toward the Mercer line. Thomas had been right. Then Abigail made a sound behind him. Jonah turned. She was standing beside a broken beam, holding a small leather notebook half frozen into the mud. On the cover, faint but clear, were her husband's initials. TM. Her hand shook as she opened it. Inside, written in Thomas Mercer's steady hand, was a list of dates, watermarks, and one name repeated 3 times. Silas Pike. Before Jonah could speak, a voice came from the trees above them. "Well now," Silas Pike said, calm and cold. "I wondered how long it would take you to find that." Silas Pike stood above them on the snowy bank, with 2 riders behind him. For one terrible second, Abigail could not breathe. The old mine cut gaped behind her, black and wet and bitter-smelling. Thomas's notebook rested open in her hands. The pages trembled in the cold, but she did not close it. Her husband's handwriting stared up at her like a voice finally returned from the grave. "Silas Pike." 3 times. Jonah moved 1 step closer to Abigail, not in front of her but near enough that she felt the choice in it. He was not taking her place. He was standing beside it. Pike noticed. His mouth curved faintly, touching. Abigail looked up at him. "You knew." "I know many things." "You knew the water was turning bad. You knew Thomas found this place." Pike looked past her toward the rusted diverter. "Your husband should have minded his own land." "This is my land." "Not for long." Jonah's eyes moved to the 2 riders. One had a coil of rope tied to his saddle. The other held a shovel across his lap. No one brought a shovel to an old mine road before dawn unless he came to bury something, move something, or hide what should have stayed hidden. Pike followed Jonah's glance. "Mr. Reed, you have a gift for appearing where you are not wanted." "Been told that lately." "You should have listened." Abigail held up the notebook. "This proves what you did." Pike laughed softly. "No, Mrs. Mercer. That proves your late husband wrote my name in a little book. Men write names for all kinds of reasons. He wrote dates, watermarks, mine channels." "And who will explain those markings in court?" Pike asked. "A widow desperate to save a failing ranch, a drifter wanted for questioning in a fire case, or a child who still cries for his father." Abigail flinched at Samuel being named. Jonah's voice went low. "Leave the boy out." Pike's smile thinned. "You grow bold for a man with a paper trail behind him." The rider on Pike's left shifted in the saddle. Jonah recognized him from town too, one of the freight yard men. Pike had not brought thinkers. He had brought hands. Abigail closed the notebook slowly and slid it inside her coat. Pike's eyes sharpened. "I will take that." "No." "You will." "No," she said again, and this time the word carried through the trees. For years Abigail had answered men from behind counters, across desks, under church awnings, and at her own gate. She had softened her voice because anger made widows look unstable. She had lowered her eyes because pride made men crueler. She had bitten down on grief because folks trusted quiet pain more than honest pain. But standing on the ridge where Thomas had once stood alone, she felt something in her refuse to bend any further. "My husband died carrying this truth," she said. "You do not get to bury it twice." Pike's face changed. "Just slightly." "Enough." He lifted one hand. The riders dismounted. Jonah whispered, "Abigail behind me." "No. This is not pride." "I know." The nearest rider came down the slope with careful boots, one hand out as if approaching a skittish horse. "Just give Mr. Pike the book, ma'am." Abigail stepped back toward the mine cut. Snow slid beneath her heel. Jonah caught her elbow before she slipped. The rider lunged for the notebook hidden under her coat. Jonah moved fast. He struck the man's wrist aside, then shoved him hard into the snow. The second rider rushed down with the shovel raised, not to kill, but to break bone if needed. Jonah turned, took the blow across his shoulder instead of his head, and staggered against the rock wall. Abigail cried his name. Jonah stayed on his feet, but pain flashed across his face. The first rider grabbed Abigail's sleeve. She swung Thomas's broken lantern from the ground with her good hand and struck him across the forearm. Glass and old metal rang against bone. The man cursed and let go. Pike shouted, "Enough, take the book." The second rider came again. Jonah caught the shovel handle and drove his shoulder into the man's chest. Both men crashed into the snow near the channel. Bitter water splashed over their boots. Above them, Pike pulled his horse around, trying to cut off the trail. Abigail looked downslope. Their horses stood tied near the pines, nervous but close. If they could reach them, they might outrun Pike's men down the old wash. If not, the notebook would vanish, and everything Thomas had died trying to prove would become another whisper Red Hollow was too afraid to hold. Jonah grabbed her hand. "Run." This time she did. They scrambled down the side path through snow and loose rock. Behind them, one rider shouted. Pike cursed. Hooves struck frozen ground above. Abigail's breath tore in her chest. Branches clawed her coat. The notebook pressed against her ribs like a living thing. Halfway down, the narrow path dipped beside the poison channel. The ground there was slick with ice stained green and orange. Abigail's boots slipped. She fell hard to one knee. Jonah turned back instantly. "Go," she gasped. He did not even answer. He pulled her up and half-carried her across the slickest part just as a rider appeared behind them. A rope sailed through the air. It caught Jonah across the chest and arm. He hit the ground hard. Abigail screamed. The rider pulled back, dragging him across snow and rock. Jonah twisted, trying to free his trapped arm, but the rope tightened. Pike rode down behind the man, face flushed with anger now stripped bare of polish. "Should have stayed in the barn," Pike said. Abigail reached inside her coat and pulled out the notebook. Pike's eyes locked on it. For one moment, the whole ridge seemed to hold its breath. Then Abigail did the only thing no one expected. She threw the notebook over the rider's head toward the lower trail. It landed in the snow, near a dark shape moving between the pines. "Samuel." The boy sat on Scout, white-faced and shaking, but his hand shot down and grabbed the notebook before it could sink. Abigail's heart stopped. "Ride," Jonah shouted from the ground. "Samuel, ride." Pike spun his horse. "Stop that boy." Samuel wheeled Scout toward the old wash. The colt bolted like the storm itself had given him legs. One rider raced after him. Pike followed, leaving Jonah struggling in the rope and Abigail standing alone on the poisoned ridge with her husband's broken lantern in her hand. Below, through the trees, Samuel vanished with the proof. And from far down the mountain came the faint sound of another wagon bell. Ezekiel Shaw was coming. Samuel rode as if every fence, field, and frozen rut in the north pasture had been carved into his bones. Scout's hooves struck the old wash road with wild speed, throwing snow and mud behind them. The notebook was shoved inside Samuel's coat, pressed flat against his chest beneath both arms. His breath came hard. His eyes watered from the cold. Behind him, a rider shouted through the trees. "Stop, boy." Samuel bent lower over Scout's neck. He did not look back. He had been told to stay at the ranch. He had promised his mother with his mouth and broken it with his heart. The moment Abigail and Jonah rode north, Samuel had stood by the gate until his hands hurt from gripping the rail. He had tried to obey, truly tried. But then he saw fresh riders cutting toward Mercy Ridge by the old freight trail, and something inside him knew obedience could become danger if grown people did not see what he saw. So he saddled Scout. Ezekiel had shouted after him, but the boy was already through the gate. Now the notebook beat against his ribs like a second heart. He heard hooves behind him, closer than before. Scout was fast but young, and the wash road was cruel. One bad step could break them both. Samuel pulled gently left where the ground dipped, avoiding a patch of black ice he knew from winter chores. The rider behind him did not know it. A horse slipped hard, screamed, and crashed into brush. Samuel flinched but kept going. Ahead, a wagon bell clanged through the timber. Ezekiel. The old feed man came around the bend with two ranchers standing in the wagon bed and Clara Boone seated beside him, wrapped in a heavy coat, her face pale but determined. Samuel had never been so glad to see ordinary people in his life. "Ezekiel," he shouted. The wagon lurched to a stop. Samuel pulled Scout so hard the colt slid sideways in the snow. He nearly fell, caught himself on the saddle horn, then jumped down with shaking legs. "They're on the ridge," he gasped. "Pike's got men. Mr. Reed is hurt. Ma's still up there." Clara climbed down before Ezekiel could answer. "Where's the proof?" Samuel pulled the notebook from inside his coat with both hands. "Pa's book." Ezekiel took it carefully, as if Samuel had handed him something holy. He opened the first page. His face changed before he reached the third line. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. A rider burst from the trees behind Samuel, one of Pike's men, hat gone, face red with anger. The horse skidded when he saw the wagon blocking the wash. "Hand that over," the man shouted. Ezekiel closed the notebook and slid it inside his coat. The two ranchers stepped down from the wagon. Clara stood in front of Samuel. She had no weapon, no size, no rough voice, only a seamstress's needle-pricked hands and a courage that had woken late but strong. "You will not touch that child," she said. The rider looked at the gathering faces and seemed to understand Pike's power did not stretch quite as far into the timber as it did on Main Street. He pulled his horse around and fled back toward the ridge. Ezekiel grabbed the reins. "Get in." Samuel shook his head. "Ma's up there. And we are going to her." The wagon rolled hard up the wash, wheels groaning over frozen ruts. Samuel sat in the back with Clara's arm around his shoulders, though he pretended he did not need it. He kept staring at the ridge through the trees. Above, Abigail was fighting to reach Jonah. The rope around Jonah's chest had tightened under one arm, dragging him against broken rock near the poisoned channel. He had managed to get his knees beneath him, but the rider holding the rope pulled again, trying to keep him down until Pike returned. Abigail swung the broken lantern once more, forcing the man back when he tried to grab her. "Let him go," she said. The rider's mouth twisted. "You should worry about yourself." "I am." She stepped between him and Jonah. It made no sense in every kind of sense. Jonah had come to her ranch with a bedroll and a quiet voice. He had asked for a place in the barn and given her truth when the town gave her pity. He had saved her colt, faced fire, carried her son's fear like it mattered. And now, tied in the snow because he had stood beside her, he was bleeding from the mouth and still trying to rise. The rider moved closer. Abigail lifted the broken lantern higher. Then Jonah spoke behind her, rough with pain. "Abigail, move." "No. I can't fight through you. I am not asking you to." The rider lunged. Before Abigail could strike, a sound cracked across the ridge. Not a gunshot. A wagon board slamming against stone. The rider turned. Ezekiel's wagon burst into the clearing below the mine cut, pulled by two furious horses and driven by an old man who looked suddenly younger than he had in years. Behind him came the blacksmith, a rancher named Owen Dale, Clara Boone, and 3 more townspeople on horseback. "Pike," Ezekiel shouted, "it's over." The rider holding Jonah's rope panicked. He dropped the line and ran for his horse. Jonah dragged the rope loose with a harsh breath. Abigail turned to help him, but he was already reaching for her instead. "You all right?" he asked. She almost laughed, almost cried. You are the one tied up in snow." Still asking. Her hand touched his shoulder gently. "I am all right." The words shook. He heard what sat beneath them. "For now." Pike came riding back into the clearing from the upper trail, his face dark with rage. He stopped when he saw the wagon and the townspeople behind it. His eyes moved quickly, counting, measuring, deciding which mask to wear next. Ezekiel climbed down holding Thomas's notebook. Pike saw it. For the first time since Abigail had known him, true fear crossed his face. "That belongs to the Mercer family," he said. Clara stepped forward. "Then it is good we found it with Mrs. Mercer's son." Pike's eyes cut toward Samuel, who was standing beside the wagon, chin lifted though his hands trembled. "You reckless little fool," Pike said. Jonah moved instantly, but Abigail caught his sleeve. Not because she wanted him still. Because she wanted this moment clean. Samuel stepped forward on his own. "My pa wrote the truth," he said, his voice thin but clear. "You tried to hide it." Pike looked at the townspeople. "This is nonsense, a child's grief, a widow's desperation, a drifter's scheme." Ezekiel opened the notebook. Thomas Mercer wrote dates going back 2 years. He marked the old mine channel, the diverter, water stains, stock sickness. He wrote that he told Sheriff Bell and Silas Pike both. The blacksmith's face hardened. Bell said Thomas was imagining things. "He wasn't," Abigail said. Her voice carried through the clearing. She stepped beside Ezekiel, snow clinging to her skirt, hair loosened from its pins, one hand bandaged and the other cut from broken lantern glass. She did not look like the careful widow Red Hollow had whispered about. She looked like the woman Thomas Mercer had trusted to keep living after him. "He found the poisoned runoff before he died," she said. "He followed it here. He wrote Pike's name because Pike owned the timber claim that let this water be diverted. And when Thomas tried to stop it, no one listened." Pike's jaw tightened. "Your husband died of fever." "Yes," Abigail said softly. "Maybe he did. Maybe the cold and the wet and the long ride home from this ridge took his strength. But you knew why he came here. You knew what he found. And after he died, you waited for my ranch to weaken enough to steal." No one spoke. Pike looked at the gathered townspeople, then at the notebook. His old smoothness returned in pieces. Even if that were true, water rights and mining runoff are county matters, complicated matters. None of you understand the law. A new voice came from behind the wagon. "Then it is fortunate I do." Everyone turned. Mr. Hargrove, the banker, stepped from the second wagon that had followed more slowly up the trail. His round face was red from the cold, and his fine boots were already ruined with mud. Beside him stood a county clerk from Deer Creek, spectacles fogged, satchel clutched to his chest. Ezekiel gave a grim smile. "Thought you ought to see the inspection early." Hargrove looked at the mine cut, the hidden diverter, the stained water, the notebook in Ezekiel's hand, and finally Abigail. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, voice quieter than usual, "I believe the bank has been given incomplete information." Abigail's laugh broke once in her throat. "Incomplete." The banker lowered his eyes. "Wrong information." Pike snapped. "Hargrove, think carefully." The banker turned to him. "I am." That was the moment the ridge changed. For months, Pike had stood behind debt, gossip, fear, and silence. But there in the snow, with the poisoned channel running green at his feet and Thomas Mercer's notebook open before witnesses, his power looked smaller. Not gone, not harmless, but smaller. Jonah stood beside Abigail, one arm held close from the shovel blow, breathing hard. Samuel moved to his mother's other side. She pulled him against her without taking her eyes off Pike. Hargrove faced the county clerk. "Record this site, all of it." The clerk nodded quickly and began opening his satchel. Pike backed toward his horse. Jonah noticed first, He's leaving. Owen Dale stepped into Pike's path. The blacksmith moved to the other side. Ezekiel held the notebook tighter. Pike looked around at them all. You cannot hold me here. No, Abigail said, but you can stand long enough to hear this. Pike glared at her. She took one step closer. You thought I would break because I was lonely. You thought a widow with a boy and a debt could be pushed until she called theft mercy. But this ranch was built with love, not your permission. And if it survives, it will not be because you spared it. It will be because the truth finally found enough people brave enough to carry it. The wind moved through the pines. Samuel pressed his face against her side. Jonah felt those words settle somewhere deep in him too. Truth needed people brave enough to carry it. He had spent 5 years carrying his own truth alone and calling it justice. But alone, truth could become a burden so heavy it bent a man toward the road and kept him there. The county clerk finished sketching the diverter and marking the channel. Hargrove spoke with Ezekiel in low tones. Clara wrapped an extra shawl around Abigail's shoulders. For the first time since dawn, Abigail seemed to realize she was shaking. Jonah stepped closer. You need to sit. She looked at him. You need a doctor. Maybe. That means yes. He tried to answer, but pain caught in his ribs and turned the breath sharp. Abigail's eyes filled with worry before she could hide it. Samuel saw it too. Ma, the boy whispered, he's hurt bad. Jonah straightened. I can ride. You can barely stand, Abigail said. I have done both worse. And that is supposed to comfort me. Before he could answer, the rider who had chased Samuel came limping back into the clearing from the lower trees, leading his horse with blood on his sleeve from the fall. He looked at Pike, then at the townspeople, then at the county clerk writing everything down. His face collapsed. I'm done, he said. Pike's head snapped toward him, quiet. No, the rider pointed toward the diverter. Pike paid us to move it today, said the widow found the lower break and the rest had to disappear before the inspection. The clearing went silent. The county clerk stopped writing, then quickly started again. The writer swallowed. Bell knew, Miles knew, we all knew enough. Pike's face turned gray. Jonah looked at Abigail. Her eyes closed, and a single tear slipped down, not from weakness, but from the terrible relief of finally hearing the truth spoken by someone who had helped bury it. For viewers who believe truth can sleep for years and still rise when one brave voice calls it out, stay with this story. The hardest part of justice is not always finding proof. Sometimes it is surviving long enough to see people stop looking away. By afternoon, Silas Pike was taken down the ridge under guard by men who had once crossed the street rather than stand near Abigail Mercer's trouble. The county clerk carried Thomas's notebook. Hargrove carried copies of the bank notice. Ezekiel carried the oil flask and the warning note. Samuel carried nothing. He walked beside Jonah's horse, one hand resting on the stirrup leather, as if afraid Jonah might vanish if he let go. Jonah rode slowly because every breath hurt. Abigail rode beside him, watching his face more than the trail. You should have told me the shovel caught your shoulder that hard, she said. Had other things happening. You always answer poorly when someone worries about you. Not much practice. That silenced her. Down below, the Mercer ranch appeared through the trees, small and white beneath the winter sky. Smoke rose from the chimney. The barn stood. The trough waited. The water line still needed work. The debt still had to be fought. Pike's fall had not fixed everything. But the ranch no longer looked alone. At the gate, Jonah tried to dismount and nearly fell. Abigail caught his arm with both hands. For a second, all the worry she had held back broke through her face. Jonah. He looked at her, and the world tilted strangely, not from pain alone. I'm all right, he said. "No," she whispered. "You keep saying that when you are not." Samuel ran for Ezekiel. Abigail helped Jonah toward the house before either of them seemed to remember the old rule. He stopped at the porch step. She looked at him. For months since Thomas died, maybe since grief first locked its teeth into the walls, the house had been a place guarded against need. Jonah had been allowed coffee on the step, stew in the barn, a blanket left without a word. But not this. Not inside. His eyes lowered. "I can sit in the barn." Abigail's face changed. The old fear moved through her, followed by something stronger. "No," she said. Then she opened the kitchen door. "You are coming inside." The kitchen door opened with a sound Jonah would remember for the rest of his life. It was only old hinges and winter-swollen wood, nothing more. Yet to him it felt like a gate in some long fence he had been walking beside for years, never believing it might open for him. Abigail stepped inside first, then turned back and held the door wide. Jonah stood on the porch with one hand against the frame, his shoulder burning from the shovel blow, his ribs tight with every breath. Snow melted from the brim of his hat and dropped onto the porch boards. Behind him, Samuel hovered close, frightened enough to forget he was trying to look grown. "You heard me," Abigail said softly. "Inside." Jonah looked past her into the kitchen. The room was warm. The stove glowed red at the seams. A kettle breathed steam into the lamplight. On the table lay a folded cloth, clean bandages, a basin of water, and Thomas Mercer's old map, now held down by a coffee cup at one corner. The house smelled of cedar smoke, soap, and bread kept too long near heat. It smelled like a life. Jonah had slept in lined shacks, livery lofts, jail corners, hay wagons, and under open sky. He had stepped into houses when work required it and out again before anyone could remember the shape of him near a hearth. But this was different. Abigail was not letting him pass through the kitchen. She was asking him to enter wounded. That took more trust than any cup of coffee on a porch. "I'll dirty your floor," he said. Her tired eyes warmed for half a second. "The floor has survived worse." Samuel pushed gently at Jonah's back. "Go on." Jonah crossed the threshold. Abigail closed the door behind him, shutting out the white yard, the ruined shed, the bitter ridge, and the road that had always waited for him. The small click of the latch made the room seem even quieter. He took 2 steps toward the chair and stopped when pain tightened through his side. Samuel darted forward. "Sit here." "I can manage." "You almost fell at the gate." That was the horse shifting. No, it was. Abigail pointed to the chair. "Sit, Jonah." He sat. Not because he lacked pride, because there was no strength left to waste pretending. The moment he lowered himself, his face went pale enough that Abigail's jaw tightened. She moved quickly, setting water near him, pulling scissors from the sewing basket, then pausing as if asking permission without words. Jonah understood. "It's only the coat," he said. "Cut what you need." Her fingers worked carefully along his sleeve. Samuel held the lamp closer, his eyes too wide. The shovel had struck Jonah hard across the upper shoulder, splitting cloth and bruising deep beneath the skin. A smaller cut ran near his collarbone where the edge had caught him. It was not the worst wound Abigail had ever seen, but it was enough. Enough to show how close the blow had come to his neck. Enough to make her imagine how easily Pike's rider might have swung higher. She cleaned the cut in silence. Jonah stared at the stove. Samuel watched her hands. "Will he be all right?" "Yes," Abigail said. Jonah glanced at her. The word was firm, almost fierce, as if she had decided the answer and dared the world to disagree. Samuel let out a slow breath. Abigail wrapped the bandage around Jonah's shoulder, her own injured hand making the work slower. When the cloth slipped, Jonah reached up to help and their fingers touched. Both of them paused. Only a moment. But Samuel saw it. He looked down fast, suddenly interested in the lamp wick. Abigail finished tying the bandage and stepped back. You should rest. I need to finish the line. You need to sit still before you fall through my kitchen table. The inspection is tomorrow. The inspection changed after today. Maybe, but banks like papers more than truth, and the water is still not clean. She hated that he was right. A knock came at the door before she could answer. Samuel stiffened, but Ezekiel's voice came from the porch. It's only me, and I brought Hargrove before he turned sensible again and hid behind his desk. Abigail opened the door. Ezekiel stepped in first, shaking snow from his hat. Mr. Hargrove followed, carrying a satchel and looking like a man who had spent the afternoon seeing himself through other people's eyes and not liking the view. Clara Boone came behind him with a wrapped loaf of bread and a folded shawl over her arm. Her gaze went to Jonah at once. You look awful. Jonah blinked. Evening to you too, ma'am. Clara set the bread on the table. That was politeness. I could have said worse. Samuel almost smiled. Hargrove removed his hat and stood awkwardly near the door. He looked at Abigail, then at Jonah, then at the map on the table. Mrs. Mercer, he began. Abigail folded her arms. If you came to tell me the inspection still stands, save your breath until morning. No, he swallowed. I came to tell you the bank will postpone the inspection pending county review of the water damage and possible fraud. The room went still. Samuel looked at his mother. Postpone means they're not taking it. Not tomorrow, Jonah said quietly. Abigail's eyes closed for 1 second. Not relief fully. She had learned not to trust relief too soon, but it was the first deep breath she had taken in days. Hargrove continued, voice heavy with discomfort. I also need to say that Mr. Pike influenced certain reports regarding your property. Ezekiel snorted. That is a soft way to say he lied. Hargrove flushed. Yes, he lied. Abigail opened her eyes. And you believed him. The banker looked down. I did. Because he was a man with money. Yes. And I was a widow with debt. Hargrove's face reddened further. Yes. The honesty did not fix what had happened, but it entered the room cleanly. Abigail seemed to know the difference. She did not forgive him. Not then. Maybe not soon, but she did not turn away from the truth either. What now? She asked. The county clerk will file a report on the mine diverter. If Pike's timber claim caused deliberate damage to your water source, he may be liable for repairs and losses. Samuel's eyes widened. He has to pay us. Possibly, Hargrove said. Ezekiel gave him a look. Hargrove corrected himself. Likely, if the clerk's report holds and Miles Dre testifies. Will Miles testify? Abigail asked. Clara answered. He will if Pike stops protecting him. And Sheriff Bell. Hargrove rubbed his forehead. The county marshal has been sent for. Bell will answer questions. Samuel looked down at his boots. He won't like that. No, Ezekiel said. Men who use power poorly never enjoy being asked what they did with it. Clara moved around the kitchen quietly, setting the bread near the stove and placing the shawl over the back of Abigail's chair. Town's talking different tonight, she said. Abigail's mouth tightened. Town talked plenty before. I know, Clara's voice softened, and too many of us let whispers do the work that courage should have done. Abigail looked at her then. Clara did not look away. I am sorry, the seamstress said. For a long moment, the kitchen was silent. Abigail's fingers rested on the table near Thomas's map. Sorry does not bring back sick horses. No. It does not give Samuel back months of fear. No. It does not bring Thomas back from that ridge. Clara's eyes filled. No. Abigail looked toward the stove, swallowing hard. But it is more than most people have said. Clara nodded, accepting that small mercy. Ezekiel cleared his throat. There's more. Some men from town are coming at first light. Blacksmith, Owen, Dale, the Carter boys, and a few others will help repair the upper line proper. Jonah tried to stand. I'll be ready. Abigail placed one hand on his good shoulder and pushed him back into the chair. You will not. He looked up at her. She looked down at him. For a moment, everyone else in the room seemed to understand something and become very interested in other objects. Samuel was the only one bold enough to grin. Jonah noticed and frowned. What? Nothing. That means something. No, sir. The word sir came naturally, and the boy realized it too late. His grin faded into shy embarrassment. Jonah pretended not to hear it, but Abigail saw the way his expression changed. Small, quiet, wounded by tenderness rather than pain. Hargrove left soon after, promising papers by morning. Ezekiel followed, saying he would sleep light and keep watch with 2 men from town near the lower road. Clara remained long enough to help sweep the last bits of broken glass from the kitchen floor, then pressed Abigail's good hand before stepping out into the night. When the door closed again, the house felt different. Not peaceful exactly. Too much had happened for peace. But it no longer felt surrounded. Samuel fought sleep in a chair near the stove until his head dipped twice. Abigail touched his shoulder. Bed. I'm not tired. You nearly fell into your own lap. He looked at Jonah. Will you still be here in the morning? Jonah did not answer quickly. Abigail heard the pause. Samuel heard it too. The boy's face changed. You said you'd stay until the inspection. The inspection moved. That's not fair. Samuel, Abigail said gently. No, he stood, suddenly angry. Everybody keeps saying what they'll do and then changing it. Pa said he'd fix the water. The sheriff said he'd help. Mr. Hargrove said Christmas. Now the inspection changed, and maybe Mr. Reed thinks that means he can leave because the worst part is over. Jonah absorbed every word like a man standing still under hail. Samuel's voice broke. The worst part is not over just because we found proof. The horses still need water. Ma still cries. I still wake up listening for someone at the barn. Abigail's face crumpled with pain. Samuel, she whispered. The boy wiped his eyes furiously. I'm going to bed. He ran upstairs before anyone could stop him. The kitchen remained silent after his footsteps disappeared. Abigail sat slowly at the table, one hand covering her mouth. Jonah looked toward the stairs, then at the door, then down at his bandaged shoulder. He is right, Jonah said. Abigail shook her head. He is a child. He is a child telling the truth. Her eyes shone. And what truth is that? Jonah looked at the stove. That I was already thinking about leaving. The words hurt the room. Abigail did not speak for a long moment. When she did, her voice was almost too calm. Why? Because he wanted this kitchen too much. Because Samuel's trust felt like a hand reaching into a locked room inside him. Because Abigail had opened the door and called him inside, and no road in all Montana seemed wide enough now to save him from what that meant. But those were not words a drifting man knew how to say. So Jonah chose the older truth. Because men like me bring shadows behind them. Abigail's expression hardened through tears. No, men like Pike bring shadows. Men like Bell protect them. Do not dress fear up as nobility and expect me not to notice. He looked at her then. She stood from the table, slow and tired but steady. You told Samuel hiding danger from someone you love does not protect them, she said. Maybe you should listen to yourself." The word love hung there, though she had not meant to place it so plainly. Both of them felt it. Abigail turned toward the sink, pretending to busy herself with the empty basin. Her shoulders trembled once. Jonah rose despite the pain and crossed the kitchen. "Abigail." "Do not," she said softly. He stopped. "I cannot ask you to stay," she continued, facing the window. "Not after Thomas. Not after knowing what it is to build a life around someone and then watch the door never open for him again. I cannot put my heart in that kind of danger just because winter made me lonely." Jonah stood behind her, close enough to see her reflection in the dark glass. "You are not lonely because it is winter," he said. "You are lonely because you loved someone well and lost him." Her eyes closed. "And I am not leaving because trouble is over," he said. "I am thinking of leaving because this house feels like something I could lose." She turned then. The room between them was small. The truth between them was not. Jonah's voice lowered. "I do not know how to stay where I am wanted." Abigail looked at him for a long time. Then she reached out with her bandaged hand and touched his sleeve, light as falling snow. "Then learn slowly," she whispered. Neither moved closer. Neither stepped away. Above them, the floorboard near Samuel's room creaked once, then went still. Outside, winter pressed against the windows, but inside the kitchen, the stove kept burning. Near dawn, Jonah woke in the chair where he had meant only to rest his eyes. A blanket had been placed over him. Not the rough gray one from the barn. A quilt from inside the house. On the table beside him sat Thomas Mercer's old gloves, repaired with new stitching across the palm. And beneath them, written in Samuel's uneven hand, was a small note. "Barn chores are easier with 2 men." By sunrise, the Mercer ranch no longer sounded like one woman fighting winter alone. Wagon wheels creaked through the yard. Men called to one another from the west fence. The blacksmith's hammer rang near the broken pipe joints. Horses shifted in their stalls, restless from all the movement but calmer than they had been in weeks. Smoke lifted steady from the kitchen chimney, thick and warm against the pale morning sky. Abigail stood on the porch with a shawl around her shoulders and watched Red Hollow come to work. For months she had ridden through that town with her chin high while doors closed softly behind her. She had carried sacks alone, paid what she could, accepted extensions that felt like insults, listened to men offer advice when what she needed was help. Now the same town had sent wagons, tools, strong backs, extra pipe, fresh feed, and 3 women carrying baskets covered in cloth. It should have comforted her. Instead, it made her ache. Kindness that arrived late still had weight. Clara Boone came up the porch steps with a covered pan in both hands. "Biscuits," she said, "and before you say you do not need them, I know." Abigail gave her a tired look. "You know what?" "That you do not need them." A faint smile touched Abigail's mouth despite herself. "Then why bring them?" "Because needing is not the only reason to accept something." Abigail looked away toward the yard. Jonah was near the pump with Samuel, his injured shoulder wrapped under his shirt and his coat hanging loose on one side. He should have been resting. Instead, he was showing Samuel how to hold a wrench against a pipe collar while Owen Dale tightened the joint. Every few minutes Jonah winced, and every few minutes Abigail told herself not to go down there and order him back inside. She failed after the 3rd time. "Jonah Reed," she called. Half the yard stopped. Jonah looked up slowly. Samuel grinned into his collar. Abigail came down the steps. "You were told to rest." "I am standing." "With a wrench in your hand." "Samuel has the wrench." Samuel held it up as if that proved everything. Abigail stopped in front of Jonah and lowered her voice. "Do not make me drag you back to the kitchen in front of all these people." Jonah looked at the men, suddenly pretending not to listen. That might hurt my standing. You are about to lose more than standing. Owen coughed into his glove. Samuel turned his face away, shoulders shaking. Jonah finally surrendered the work with a small nod. I can sit on the fence and give poor advice. That seems closer to your strength today. His eyes warmed. Yes, ma'am. The ma'am made her want to scold him again. The warmth in his eyes made her forget how. She walked back toward the house before anyone could see too much on her face. By noon, the west line was open from the trough to the ridge channel. The hidden diverter had been removed under the county clerk's watch, and a clean temporary line had been laid from the upper spring to the holding tank. It would not be perfect, not yet, but for the first time, water ran clear into the trough and stayed clear. Samuel stood beside it, holding one of Jonah's testing strips. The cloth remained pale. He stared at it as if it were a miracle. "Ma," he whispered. Abigail came closer. The sorrel mare approached first, cautious and stiff. She lowered her head, sniffed the water, then drank, one swallow, then another. Then she kept drinking. Abigail covered her mouth with her good hand. No one spoke. Even the men near the trench went quiet. The sound of that horse drinking clean water seemed to reach back through every hard month and touch the place where fear had lived. Samuel wiped his sleeve across his face and pretended it was from the cold. "She likes it." Abigail nodded, unable to speak. Jonah stood a few steps behind them, watching the mare, but Abigail knew he was watching her too. She could feel the steadiness of his presence without turning. That had become the dangerous thing. Not his strength, not his knowledge, the steadiness. A man could save a barn in one night and still remain a stranger. But a man who kept showing up at the trough, the fence, the kitchen chair, the boys' questions, and the quiet places where grief had no words began to become something else. Near evening, riders came from Deer Creek. The county marshal arrived with 2 deputies and a face that looked carved from old oak. Sheriff Bell rode behind them, no badge on his coat. His hands were not tied, but the absence of the badge seemed heavier than rope. Red Hollow followed at a distance, drawn by the sight of power being brought low. Abigail stood near the porch as the marshal dismounted. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "I need your statement." "You will have it." His eyes moved toward Jonah. "And yours, Mr. Reed." Jonah's jaw tightened. He nodded. The marshal studied him longer than Abigail liked. "There is also the matter of Clearwater Crossing." The yard grew quieter. Samuel stepped closer to Jonah without thinking. Abigail saw the old shadow move over Jonah's face. The room in him that had opened slightly over the past days seemed ready to close again. The marshal continued, "I received word this morning from a retired deputy in Clearwater. Seems a former Carrigan foreman, dying from lung sickness, gave a statement 2 months ago." Jonah went still. He admitted the Reed boy at that line shack had uncovered stolen cattle records. Said 2 Carrigan riders killed each other in a fight after the fire started, and that Jonah Reed pulled his brother from the shack before fleeing because the foreman blamed him. The words did not seem to land at first. Jonah stood as if the cold had entered his bones and made him unable to move. Abigail's breath caught. "Then he is cleared." The marshal looked at Jonah. The old questioning notice should have been pulled. It was not. That failure will be corrected. Samuel's face lit with fierce relief. "You hear that?" Jonah looked down. Samuel grabbed his sleeve. "Mr. Reed, you hear?" Jonah nodded once, but his eyes were far away. 5 years of road dust could not be washed off a man in one sentence. 5 years of being named by another man's lie did not vanish because a marshal finally said corrected. Abigail understood that in her own way. Truth could arrive late and still leave ruins behind. The marshal took statements until dusk. Bell spoke little. Pike, who had been held in town under guard, refused to answer without counsel. Miles Dray had agreed to testify. The rider from the ridge had already given enough to bring charges for fraud, sabotage, and conspiracy. Hargrove admitted the bank had relied on false reports. The county clerk's sketches and Thomas's notebook had been sealed as evidence. All of it sounded official. Important. Still, Abigail kept thinking of Thomas alone at this table, writing down dates by candlelight while no one believed him. After the marshal finished, Samuel walked up the hill to his father's grave. Abigail watched from the yard, then followed at a distance. Jonah remained near the barn, giving them space. Snow had thinned on the hill where the afternoon sun touched it. The wooden cross stood under the cottonwood, simple and weather-worn. Samuel knelt and brushed away the remaining snow at its base. Abigail stopped beside him. For a while neither spoke. Then Samuel pulled Thomas's old gloves from inside his coat. The repaired stitching showed fresh and uneven across the palm. "I gave them to Mr. Reed," he said. "I know. I thought Pa should help." Abigail's eyes filled. Samuel looked up at her. "Is that wrong?" She knelt beside him, pulling him close with one arm. "No, sweetheart, that is not wrong. He saved us too, didn't he? Pa, I mean." Abigail looked at the cross. The ridge was dark now beyond the valley, but the truth Thomas had left had finally crossed it. His map, his notebook, his stubborn refusal to let bitter water go unnamed. "Yes," she whispered, "he saved us too." Samuel leaned against her. "Do you think he'd be mad that we like Jonah?" The question struck deep. Abigail closed her eyes. The honest answer rose slowly. Thomas had loved her with open hands. He had never made home feel like a locked room. He had laughed when Samuel tracked mud across the floor, kissed Abigail's forehead when she worried too much, and once told her that love was not a grave marker. It was something living people were supposed to carry forward. "No," she said, her voice shaking. "I do not think he would be mad." Samuel nodded, as if he had needed permission from both the living and the dead. When they walked back down, Jonah was waiting beside the barn, hat in hand. Abigail could tell he had been deciding something. She felt it before he spoke. The yard had emptied slowly. Townspeople had gone home. The temporary line was covered. The horses were fed. The ranch stood under the first clear evening in days. Jonah looked at Samuel first. "Your mother and I need to talk." Samuel's face closed. "You're leaving." "Not tonight." "That is not an answer." "No," Jonah said gently, "it is not." Abigail's chest tightened. Samuel looked at his mother, then back at Jonah. "I'm tired of almost losing people." The words broke something open in all three of them. Jonah crouched despite the pain it cost him. "I know." "You don't, you keep choosing it." Jonah's face changed. The boy had struck true. Samuel's voice lowered. "You say you don't know how to stay where you're wanted, but maybe you just don't know how to believe people want you." The yard went silent. Abigail looked at her son, startled by the plain wisdom grief had forced into him too early. Jonah stared at the ground. Then he said, "Maybe so." Samuel wiped at his face angrily, "Then believe harder." Abigail almost laughed and cried at once. Jonah looked up at the boy. "I will try." Samuel held his gaze. "Trying means tomorrow too." "Yes." "And the day after." Jonah swallowed. "Yes." Samuel seemed to accept that for now. He turned and went inside, leaving Abigail and Jonah alone in the blue evening. The kitchen window glowed behind them. A horse nickered softly from the barn. Far off, a coyote called from the ridge, lonely and thin. Abigail folded her arms against the cold. "He says things plainly. He gets that from you. He gets that from hurt." Jonah looked toward the hill. Sometimes hurt tells the truth faster. She studied him, and what truth is yours tonight? He took a long breath. The marshal cleared my name. Yes, that should make staying easier. But it does not. No, he looked at her then, it makes leaving harder. Her heart hurt with how softly he said it. Jonah continued, for years I told myself I drifted because no town wanted a man carrying my name. But that was not all of it. I drifted because if I never stayed, I never had to watch another home burn, another brother die, another person look at me like I had failed them. You did not fail, Eli. I know that in my head. And your heart? He gave a tired half smile. My heart is slower. Abigail stepped closer, so is mine. The wind lifted loose strands of her hair. Jonah looked at her the way a starving man might look at bread and fear reaching for it. She touched his sleeve, the same small touch she had given him the night before. If this moment has reached you, tell me in the comments whether you believe a wounded heart can learn to trust again. Some people do not need grand promises. They need someone patient enough to stay while the heart learns slowly. Her voice faded into the quiet. Jonah covered her hand with his. No kiss came, no sudden confession, no easy ending rushed ahead of its time. Only two people standing between grief and hope, choosing not to run from the silence. Then a rider appeared on the road from town. Ezekiel Shaw. He rode hard, coat flying open, face dark with worry. Abigail stepped away from Jonah as Ezekiel reined in near the porch. What is it? She asked. Ezekiel looked from her to Jonah. It's Pike, he said. He got loose from the holding room. Samuel appeared in the doorway behind them. Ezekiel's voice dropped. And he took one of the bank ledgers with him. The name Pike moved through the yard like a cold wind. For a moment, no one spoke. The clear evening that had almost felt peaceful seemed to harden around them. The horses inside the barn shifted uneasily, as if they too understood that trouble had not finished its ride through Mercer land. Abigail stared at Ezekiel. How? Ezekiel swung down from his horse, breathing hard. Bell's deputy left the back room unlatched while the marshal was questioning Miles. Pike was supposed to be watched. By the time anyone noticed, he was gone. Jonah's face darkened, and the ledger. Taken from Hargrove's office. Pike must have known where the bank kept the old collateral records. Abigail's hand went cold. Samuel stepped out from the doorway. What does that mean? The grown people went silent in the way that told a child it meant something bad. Jonah looked at Abigail, then answered honestly. It means Pike may have taken papers tied to your ranch debt. Samuel's jaw tightened. Can he still steal the ranch? No, Abigail said too quickly. Jonah did not correct her in front of the boy, but his eyes told the truth. If Pike had the right ledger, he could destroy records, change blame, hide names, or make it harder to prove how deeply the fraud reached. The county clerk had Thomas's notebook, but bank papers could show who had pushed the inspection, who had reported false losses, who stood to profit if the note was called early. Pike was not running empty-handed. He was trying to bury the last trail behind him. Ezekiel removed his hat and wiped his brow with his sleeve. Marshall's gathering riders. He thinks Pike will head south. Jonah looked toward the north ridge. No, he said. Abigail turned to him. You think he came here? I think Pike knows the south road will be watched. He knows the town is turning against him. He knows the ledger is only useful if he can hide it or burn it before the marshal catches up. Jonah's eyes lifted toward Mercy Ridge, dark against the fading sky. And there are mine cuts up there deep enough to swallow paper forever. Samuel went pale, where Pa's book was. Yes. Abigail's voice lowered. Then we tell the marshal. We will, Jonah said. But by the time he gathers men and rides from town, Pike could already be up there. Ezekiel understood first. You aim to cut him off. Abigail stepped closer, not alone. Jonah looked at her hand, still bandaged, then at the weariness around her eyes. You have done enough today. Her face hardened. Do not start that again. This is different. No, it is always different when a man wants to make danger sound like his private burden. She grabbed her coat from the porch rail. If Pike is carrying papers that can hurt my son's future, then I ride. Samuel moved forward. I'm coming too. Both Abigail and Jonah said, no. This time the boy did not argue. He simply looked at Jonah with a pain too old for his face. You promised tomorrow too. Jonah's expression shifted. The promise from only minutes earlier stood between them, fragile and heavy. I remember, Jonah said. Then don't ride off and not come back. Abigail put both hands on Samuel's shoulders. You are staying with Ezekiel. Samuel looked ready to protest, but Ezekiel spoke gently. Son, I need someone here who knows the ranch better than me. If Pike sends a man down while your ma and Jonah are gone, I need your eyes. That worked better than command. Samuel swallowed. Then I watch from the barn loft. You watch from the house, Abigail said. The loft sees more. The house has thicker walls. Jonah crouched, though pain crossed his face as he did. Samuel, listen to me. Courage is not always chasing danger. Sometimes courage is guarding what danger wants. The boy's eyes filled, but he nodded once. Jonah held out Thomas Mercer's repaired gloves. Keep these till I get back. Samuel stared at them. No, you need them. I need a reason to return for them. That broke the boy's hard face. He took the gloves and held them tight against his chest. Abigail looked away quickly. Ezekiel mounted again. I'll ride toward town and meet the marshal, send him north. You two take the pasture trail. If Pike is headed for the ridge, you may see his tracks before dark. Jonah nodded. Do not wait for us if you find the marshal. Bring him straight up. Within minutes, Jonah and Abigail were riding north across the pasture under a sky turning purple at the edges. The snow had crusted thin where afternoon light had touched it. Their horses moved carefully, breath smoking, ears sharp. Behind them, the Mercer ranch shrank into the valley, its windows glowing like small promises. Abigail kept her eyes forward. Jonah rode beside her, his injured shoulder held stiff. You should not be riding, she said. You invited me inside. Now you start fussing like I belong there. I am not fussing. You are. She gave him a sideways look. You are very bold for a man I can still send back to the barn. He almost smiled. Then the ridge wind cut between them and the moment passed. They found Pike's tracks near the upper wash. One horse, moving fast, cutting away from the town road toward the old mine trail. Jonah dismounted and touched the print. Fresh. How far ahead? Not much. He is pushing the horse too hard. They followed at a quicker pace. The timber thickened. Evening settled fast beneath the pines. The trail narrowed into a dark ribbon between snowbanks and exposed roots. Twice Abigail's horse slipped, and twice Jonah reached to steady the bridle before she could ask. She noticed. He noticed her noticing. Neither spoke. At the first bend below the mine cut, they heard the horse. A harsh, tired snort from above. Jonah lifted his hand. They dismounted and tied their horses behind a screen of pine branches. Then they climbed the last stretch on foot. The old mine clearing appeared in broken pieces through the trees, rusted rails, collapsed beams, the poisoned channel now partly dismantled, and beside the black mouth of the cut stood Silas Pike, coat torn, hat gone, face wild in the fading light. He held the bank ledger open over a small flame. Abigail gasped softly. Pike's head snapped up. Jonah stepped from the trees, put it down. Pike looked at him, then at Abigail emerging beside him. Something cruel and almost amused crossed his face. "Of course," Pike said, "the widow and her barn saint." Abigail's voice was steady. "That ledger belongs to the bank." Pike laughed. "The bank belongs to men who know how money works, not women clinging to graves, not drifters pretending a few heroic days can wash away a wanted notice." Jonah moved slowly toward him. "My notice is cleared." For the first time, Pike looked unsettled. Abigail saw it and stepped forward. "Your lies are ending one by one." Pike's grip tightened around the ledger. The flame below him licked higher, catching one corner of a loose page. "Lies. This whole valley runs on lies. Hargrove lies when he calls debt mercy. Bell lies when he calls fear law. Farmers lie when they say they respect widows but wait to see who will win before helping one." His eyes burned into Abigail. "I only understood the world better than you did." "No," Abigail said. "You only loved owning what other people needed." Pike's face twisted. He threw one loose page into the flame. Abigail rushed forward, but Jonah caught her arm. Pike stepped backward toward the mine entrance, ledger pressed to his chest. "Another step," Pike warned, "and the rest burns." Jonah held still. The flame snapped over the fallen page. Abigail's eyes followed it in horror. Somewhere inside that ledger might be the proof that the bank had been twisted against her. Proof of false reports. Proof that Pike had planned the inspection around the damage he caused. Pike backed closer to the dark mine mouth. "You should have sold when I gave you the chance." Abigail's voice trembled now, not with fear but with fury. "You call that a chance? I call it survival. You poison our water. I used what the ridge gave me. You set men against my home. I used men who needed wages. You let my husband die with people calling him foolish." Pike's expression went cold. "Your husband should have known when to stop digging." The words broke something. For Abigail, the whole world narrowed to that sentence. Thomas at the table by candlelight. Thomas coughing through his last winter. Thomas trying to tell a town what he had found while men smiled and waited for him to fail. Jonah saw her move and knew he could not stop her without hurting her. Abigail stepped toward Pike. "You do not speak of him," she said. Pike raised the ledger over the flame. Jonah moved then. Not toward Pike. Toward the old sluice board beside the channel. He kicked it hard. The board cracked loose and dropped into the runoff, sending a sudden rush of cold water over the shallow fire. Steam exploded upward. Pike startled and stumbled back. Abigail lunged for the ledger. Pike twisted away. Jonah reached him at the same moment, catching Pike's wrist. The three of them struggled at the mouth of the mine, boots slipping in mud and snow. The ledger fell open between them, pages flapping wildly in the wind. Pike drove his elbow into Jonah's injured shoulder. Jonah's grip faltered. Pike tore free and stumbled backward into the mine entrance. The ground beneath him gave a low crack. Everyone froze. A rotted support beam shifted overhead. Pebbles spilled down from the dark ceiling. Jonah lifted one hand. "Do not move." Pike stared at him, breathing hard. Another crack came from inside the cut. The old floor near the entrance had weakened from years of seepage. Pike's boot had broken through the edge of a hidden hollow beneath the boards. One more step could drop him into the lower shaft. Abigail stood 2 paces away, holding half the ledger cover in her hand. The rest remained clutched in Pike's grip. For the first time, Pike looked truly afraid. "Help me," he whispered. The words sounded strange coming from him. Abigail stared. This man had watched her ranch suffer, had used her grief like a tool, had let Thomas's truth rot under snow, had tried to burn, frighten, shame, and steel until nothing remained but surrender. Now he stood at the edge of his own darkness, asking her for mercy. Jonah stepped forward carefully. "Give me the ledger." Pike shook his head. The beam above groaned. "Give it to him," Abigail said. Pike looked at her. His hand trembled. Then slowly he threw the ledger toward Jonah. Jonah caught it against his chest. At that same moment, the rotten floor shifted. Pike dropped to one knee with a cry, one leg breaking through the boards. The shaft below swallowed loose stones into blackness. Abigail moved first. Jonah shouted her name, but she was already reaching out. She grabbed Pike's coat sleeve with both hands, bandage tearing loose from her palm. Jonah seized the back of Pike's coat and pulled with his good arm, pain tearing across his shoulder. For several terrible seconds, all three of them strained against the mine's pull. Then Pike came free, collapsing into the snow outside the entrance. No one moved. The old support beam gave one final crack behind them, and part of the entrance fell inward with a thunder of timber and stone. Dust rolled out black and bitter into the cold air. Pike lay on his side, shaking. Abigail stood over him, breathing hard, blood showing again on her palm. Pike looked up at her, dazed. Why? She understood what he meant. Why save him? Why reach? Why not let the mine take what had tried to take everything from her? Abigail looked toward the collapsed entrance, then down at the man in the snow. "Because my husband's truth deserves justice," she said quietly, "not another grave." Jonah looked at her then, with something deeper than admiration. Down the trail, voices rose. The marshal's riders were coming through the trees with Ezekiel at the front and Samuel behind him on scout, despite every order he had been given. "Ma," Samuel shouted. Abigail turned just as he slid from the saddle and ran to her. "I told you to stay home," she said, wrapping him close. "I watch from the house," he said into her coat. "Then I watch from scout." Ezekiel arrived breathless. "I tried stopping him." "No, you didn't," Jonah said. Ezekiel sighed. "Not hard enough." The marshal took Pike into custody there beneath the broken mine cut. Pike did not fight now. His face had gone hollow. One deputy gathered the soaked ledger. Another marked the burnt pages and the collapsed entrance. The county clerk, dragged from his supper in Red Hollow, arrived soon after and looked ready to faint at the sight of more evidence. Samuel held Abigail's hand the whole time. Jonah stood apart near the channel, one arm around his ribs, watching the last light leave the ridge. The wind had turned colder. His body ached. His past had been cleared. Pike had fallen. The ledger had been saved. Everything that should have made the road easier now made it harder to imagine. Abigail came to stand beside him while the marshal led Pike away. "You saved him," Jonah said. "So did you. I would have understood if you hadn't." She looked at the dark mine entrance. "So would I. That is what scared me." He turned toward her. She met his eyes. "I do not want to become someone grief can twist beyond recognition." "You are not." "Maybe because people kept reaching for me when I nearly did." Jonah said nothing. Below them, Red Hollow's lanterns began to glow in the valley. The Mercer ranch sat among them, small and waiting. For the first time, the sight did not look like a burden to Abigail. It looked like a place ready for morning. Samuel called from the horses, "Are we going home?" "Home." The word moved between Abigail and Jonah like a question neither had yet answered fully. Abigail looked at Jonah. "Are we?" He looked at the trail, then at the ranch lights below, then at Samuel holding Thomas's gloves against his chest. His voice came rough. "Yes." Abigail's eyes softened. Together, they walked down from Mercy Ridge, leaving the bitter water behind them, while the last snow of evening fell quietly over the broken mine. By the time they reached the Mercer ranch, night had settled over the valley like a dark quilt stitched with lantern light. The yard was quiet, but not empty. Ezekiel rode in first and opened the gate. Samuel followed on scout, trying hard to sit tall though exhaustion had bent his shoulders. Abigail came behind him with Jonah close at her side. The marshal and his deputies took Pike toward town with the rescued ledger wrapped in canvas, while the county clerk carried Thomas Mercer's notebook as carefully as a Bible. No one cheered when Pike was led away. That would have felt too small for what had happened. Instead, the people who had gathered near the road only watched in silence. Some lowered their heads when Abigail passed. Some lifted a hand. Clara Boone stood near the porch with tears on her cheeks and said nothing at all. Abigail was grateful for the silence. She had no strength left for speeches. Inside the barn, the horses shifted softly as Samuel entered. Scout nudged the boy's shoulder as if proud of himself. Samuel wrapped both arms around the colt's neck and finally let himself cry. Not loud, not like a child seeking attention, just quiet tears into warm horsehair after days of being brave past what any boy should have been asked to bear. Abigail stepped toward him, but Jonah touched her sleeve. "Give him a breath," he said softly. She looked at her son, then nodded. Samuel had carried fear, proof, anger, and hope down a mountain. He had earned a private moment with the horse who brought him home. In the kitchen, Clara had left a pot of stew warming on the stove and fresh bread wrapped in cloth. Abigail stood just inside the doorway, looking at it all as if she had returned to a different house. The same table, the same stove, the same window over the sink, but something had changed. For months, every corner of that kitchen had held a worry. The ledger no longer sat there like a death sentence. The broken glass had been swept away. Thomas's map rested folded near the lamp, not hidden in a drawer anymore. Outside, clean water moved through the new line. The horses would recover. The bank could no longer call her failure without answering for the lies that created it. The ranch had not been saved by one grand miracle. It had been saved by a dead man's notes, a widow's refusal, a boy's courage, a drifter's steady hands, and a town that finally grew ashamed enough to become brave. Jonah stood near the kitchen threshold. "Again." Abigail noticed and turned. "You are inside already." "I know." "Then, why do you look like you are asking permission from the floorboards?" He looked down, almost embarrassed. "Habit." She walked to him slowly. Her bandaged hand had come loose again from the ridge, and dried blood marked the edge of the cloth. His shoulder was stiff, his face pale with pain, but his eyes were clearer than she had ever seen them. "You said you did not know how to stay where you are wanted," she said. "I remember." "Then start with tonight." He swallowed. A simple answer should have been easy. "Yes, I will stay." 4 words. Yet Jonah had spent years turning away before want could become need. He had slept beneath open skies because open skies never asked him to belong. But now Samuel's note sat in his coat pocket. Thomas's gloves had been placed back in his hands. Abigail Mercer stood before him with winter in her hair and hope in her eyes, offering not rescue, not debt, not pity. "A place." "I can stay tonight," he said. Abigail's face softened, though tears gathered before she could stop them. "And tomorrow?" He looked through the kitchen window toward the barn, where Samuel's small shadow moved beside Scout's stall. "Tomorrow too." Her breath trembled. That was enough for now. In the weeks that followed, Red Hollow changed in the slow, uneven way towns do when truth has embarrassed them into decency. Sheriff Bell was removed from office and taken to Deer Creek to answer for his part in Pike's scheme. Miles Dre and the Ridge Rider testified. Silas Pike's records, recovered from the bank ledger, showed false reports, hidden payments, and a planned claim on Mercer land once the bank forced sale. The county court did not heal grief, but it brought consequences. Pike lost his timber claim on Mercy Ridge. The hidden diversion was destroyed under county watch. The bank withdrew the inspection and rewrote the Mercer note, crediting damages against the debt. Hargrove stood in Abigail's kitchen one cold morning, hat in hand, and gave her papers that said the ranch was safe through spring. She read every line twice. Then she looked at him and said, "Next time, believe the person living the trouble before the man profiting from it." Hargrove nodded, "Yes, ma'am." By late winter, the horses began moving easier. The sorrel mare no longer turned from the trough. Scout grew bold enough to nip at Samuel's coat whenever the boy carried oats. The repaired water line held through 3 storms. Men from town came twice to help strengthen the upper trench, and this time they came without needing public shame to push them. Jonah worked slowly at first because Abigail watched him like a hawk whenever he lifted anything heavy. He complained once. Only once. Samuel laughed for a full minute after that. Something gentle took root in the house. It did not erase Thomas. Nothing ever would. His grave on the hill remained tended, and his name was spoken at the table without fear. Sometimes Samuel told Jonah stories about him. Sometimes Abigail did. Jonah listened to each one carefully, never trying to fill the space Thomas left, only honoring it. That was how trust grew. Not by replacing the past. By making room beside it. One evening, when the first signs of spring softened the snow near the fence line, Abigail found Jonah in the barn loft rolling his old bedroll. Her heart clenched before she could stop it. "You leaving?" she asked. Jonah looked up, then followed her eyes to the bedroll. Understanding crossed his face. "No," he said gently, putting it away. She stood very still. He tied the roll and set it on the shelf above the tack box, where old things rested when they were no longer needed every night. "I thought maybe the loft should have more room for hay," he said. Abigail tried to answer, but no words came. Jonah stepped closer, careful, as if trust was still something alive and easily startled. "I told you once I would stay in the barn." "You did." "I meant it then." "I know." He looked toward the house window glowing across the yard. Samuel's laughter drifted faintly from inside, followed by the clatter of a dropped spoon. Jonah's voice softened, "But I do not think the barn is where I belong anymore." Abigail's eyes filled. From her apron pocket, she took the old brass house key, the same one she had placed in his hand once before, when hope was still trembling between them. This time, he closed his fingers around it. Not like a man accepting shelter. Like a man accepting home. Spring came to Bitterroot Valley in green patches. Water ran clear from Mercy Ridge. Grass returned along the pasture. The Mercer Ranch no longer looked like a place waiting to die. It looked like a place that had survived winter and remembered how to live. And on quiet evenings, when lantern light glowed in the kitchen and Boots stood beside the same door, Abigail sometimes looked across the table at Jonah and saw not the stranger who had arrived in a storm, but the man who stayed after the storm had passed. Some people save a life by riding in at the right moment. But some save a family in quieter ways. They mend the line, they carry the water, they sit with the boy, they honor the dead, they stay when leaving would be easier. And that was how Jonah Reed, the cowboy who promised to sleep in the barn, became the hope Abigail Mercer never thought she would ask for again. If this story touched your heart, tell me where you are listening from and which moment stayed with you most. And if you believe love can still grow after loss, stay close to this trail. There are more Wild West stories waiting beyond the next ridge, where broken hearts, brave choices, and quiet kindness still find their way home.